Chapter 66, The Coronation I. There are two things humans have no limits for: arrogance and stupidity. Tyrion Lannister, Lord of the West and Hand of the King. Seeing Rhaenys hugging Riella, Enar smiled and looked at Moonfire. The dragon was bigger than the last time he had seen him. However, the dragon's beauty was truly breathtaking. After hugging Riella and listening to her whispers of longing and maternal love, Rhaenys looked at her aunts, both incredibly beautiful women. Honestly, she felt a little inferior to them. The two women in front of her really did look like goddesses in a mortal world. "Welcome to Volantis, niece." Visenya greeted her niece with a sweet, warm smile. Syrax was on her shoulder looking at the surroundings with a curious gaze, like any 7-month-old baby. "We've waited a long time to meet, niece." Daenerys also greeted Rhaenys with a happy look. Nothing could be happier than a family reunited in her eyes. The atmosphere was a little awkward, given that they were meeting for the first time, but after their words, Rhaenys became more comfortable and started talking to her two aunts with a smile on her face. "Your dragon is beautiful," Visenya commented, looking at Moonfire next to Caraxes. The silver dragon with purple stripes really was a sight to behold. Rhaenys smiled proudly upon hearing this and looked at the 3 baby dragons with a bright gaze. "They're adorable," she said with a gentle tone. Suddenly, Rhaenys felt a blow to her head and looked at Enar with a watery gaze, who stared back at her with a scolding look. "That hurt. That's for you to learn to respect my words. You shouldn't have come riding Moonfire. She's too small, and what would happen if you rode into a storm?" Enar didn't hesitate to scold Rhaenys with a strong and powerful tone. Moonfire was a little bigger than a car. In the face of a storm, such a small dragon was no different than a small ant. Seeing Enar fiercely disciplining Rhaenys, Riella, Visenya and Daenerys watched with a few laughs. They thought it was funny to see their younger brother disciplining their older sister. "But I'm glad you arrived safely." Enar spoke in a softer tone. "My coronation will start in 3 days. I'm glad you made it in time." Rhaenys also had a smile on her face. "I could never miss something so important." Enar nodded. He really wasn't angry about Rhaenys' arrival in Moonfire, but he had to control her temper or she might well go to King's Landing and burn down the entire Red Keep. Something that couldn't happen, given the hundreds of barrels of wildfire under the city at the moment. His grandfather was truly insane for wanting to burn down the most important city in Westeros and House Targaryen. Just as Enar was about to invite Rhaenys to lunch, he saw Kinvara approaching and, "Your Grace." "Something important, Kinvara?" Enar asked, even though he knew the answer that would come at that moment. "The ancient Triarchs request an audience with your Grace." Kinvara replied with a cold tone, something quite rare, given that she was someone who was naturally warm. But Enar understood very well the reason for Kinvara's cold tone. The Triarchs were the biggest obstacle to the domination of Volantis, and have not yet been resolved by hiding behind the Black Walls. These 3 men set up the resistance of the Red Faith's enemies, causing a battle that was supposed to be resolved in a month to stretch into an entire year, causing countless casualties. "Come on, I'm going to meet the Triarchs." Enar spoke to Kinvara, who bowed in acceptance of his words. The 4 remaining members of House Targaryen were curious about the Triarchs' arrival. They had heard of the Triarchs, the former rulers of Volantis, men who did not touch the ground with their feet during their entire term of office. In the Great Hall of the Throne, Enar was on his throne while other seats were placed to the side. Rhaenys looked at Visenya and Daenerys sitting to the left and right of Enar's throne respectively and felt a pang of pain in her heart. She could see that the 3 of them seemed close, too close, but nothing out of the ordinary when you thought of them as members of House Targaryen. It wasn't just members of House Targaryen who were present, but also House Martell, along with Banero, Kinvara and Makoro. The entire court of Enar was present, including Leda Dane, Lady Commander of the Kingsguard, and the other members of it. Enar's eyes were fixed on the 3 men being carried by slaves on palanquins. Even though they had been stripped of their power and positions, they still thought they were the true rulers of Volantis. Seeing Enar in silence with no intention of greeting them, one of the men, the eldest, called Malakwo Mager, had lilac eyes and thinning whitish hair. He no longer had teeth and spoke in a funny way. "Your Grace, Volantis is happy to welcome such a noble character." The old man's lilac eyes fell on the 3 dragon children in the arms of the 3 Targaryen women, and he couldn't help but feel his heart pound with excitement and greed. If House Mager had dragons, they would conquer Volantis in just a few years. Enar's eyes turned cold, sensing the unscrupulous greed emanating from the arrogant old man in front of them. Using his other ability called voice, Enar spoke with a powerful, high-pitched tone. "Come down and kneel before me." Under everyone's shocked eyes, the three men climbed down from the palanquins and knelt below the steps, each showing an incredulous expression, full of anger and reluctance. "Now you're in the right place to talk to me," Enar commented with a cold, regal tone. He really didn't understand how these people still thought they were powerful and influential even then. Hadn't he shown enough strength? How many did he have to kill to be respected? Hundreds of thousands? Millions of people? Burn entire civilizations? Damned witch! Nyeso's vassar shouted as he felt he couldn't control his body to get up. He raised his head and looked angrily at Enar, sitting on the throne above the steps. "Leda." Enar spoke calmly. "What are your orders, my king?" Leda, wearing white armor and a white cloak over her shoulders, positioned herself while holding Dawn's fist. "Cut off his head if he speaks again." Enar didn't mind the surprised looks on everyone's faces and ordered coldly. "Yes, my king." Leda replied with a cold tone, her gray eyes falling on the Triarch kneeling on the ground. "How dare you, you damned exiled Targaryen!" Nyeso screamed even louder when he heard Enar's threat against his life. He couldn't believe that Enar would dare kill him. He was Patriarch of House Vassar, one of the richest in Volantis. He could hire entire armies with the money accumulated over millennia. "I swear that when I return I will hire an army of mercenaries to overthrow you from this false throne." Nyesos tried to finish his speech, but his words stopped abruptly. Under the eyes of the two other Triarchs, his head fell to the ground and rolled a few times before stopping, leaving a trail of blood across the marble. His expression was one of rage. He died without realizing he was dead. Until the final moment, he never thought that Enar would actually be able to kill him. The slaves of House Vassar couldn't help but show a sick pleasure at seeing their master die in such a banal and insignificant way. Malakwo and Donifos swallowed. They had never thought that Enar would actually order the death of a Triarch of House Vassar. Didn't he know that he had created a blood feud that could only be resolved with the complete destruction of the enemy? Leda returned Dawn to its sheath and looked coldly at the other two Triarchs, waiting for any word from them. A deafening silence hung over the room. Of the two, only Enar seemed truly comfortable in the stifling atmosphere. 5 minutes passed and nothing but silence. The two remaining Triarchs were sweating more than pigs on an extremely hot day. How long had it been since they had felt this oppressed? It was as if the boy sitting on the throne was a mountain weighing down on their shoulders. They could do nothing but lower their heads, not daring to look up to see Enar's face. Kinvara took great pleasure in seeing how humiliated the Triarchs were. Only she knew how many nights she had dreamt of those old pigs dying. She had lost many men and women to those filthy vermin. "You have permission to speak, dear Triarch Malakwo." Enar finally gave the man permission to speak without being killed by Leda. "Don't be afraid to speak your doubts, dear Triarchs. I am someone who is very understanding." Malakwo and Donifos looked at each other and saw the skepticism in each other's eyes after hearing Enar's words. Understanding? If Enar was understanding, then they were wise men endowed with patience and wisdom. Chapter 67, The Coronation 2. Wealth, a word that moves the hearts of commoners to great lords. In the end, a gold coin was much more valuable than a life. Willis Tyrell, master of coin. Oberyn looked at the dead Triarch and gradually understood how Enar acted and how he preferred to have a conversation. Believe me, this was something that every vassal had to understand when talking to his liege. It could save lives and avoid any war over some foolish comment. Just like the Triarch who has just died, if the man had been more respectful and less arrogant in front of a king, he would probably be alive right now. Oberyn wanted to learn how Enar thought, about the things he didn't like and the things he did like. Even if the chances were slim, it was all to avoid being his head rolling on the floor. "I beg your pardon for my companion, but I have come before your grace with a request." Malakwo smiled gently as he settled down on the marble floor in a more comfortable position. He was the oldest of the three and knew very well how to control his emotions. "You've earned my attention, Triarch Malakwo." Enar looked interested and gave the old man a thoughtful look. "I would like to buy from your dragons, your grace." When Malakwo said this, his companion Donifos looked at the Triarch in confusion. Obviously it wasn't the same request they had agreed on earlier. Yes, after seeing the 3 dragon chicks, Malakwo wanted to buy a dragon. Just imagining House Maegor becoming a glorious house of dragon lords was enough for him to be remembered for all of history. There wasn't a single noble house descended from ancient Valyria that didn't want to become a dragon lord. It was the dream of many noble houses, and House Maegor was no different in that respect. However, the man didn't realize that when he said this, a look of pure fury appeared in the eyes of Daenerys, Visenya, Rhaenys, and Rhaella. The four women wanted to tear the filthy old man apart in front of them. They never thought that Malakwa would be so arrogant as to ask them to sell the dragons. Daenerys snorted coldly but remained silent. She knew that Enar would never agree to something like that. Dragons belonged to House Targaryen and no one else. Anyone who dared to get their hands on dragons was to be killed to set an example for others who were secretly greedy. However, contrary to what everyone thought, that Enar would personally kill the man, he laughed and asked with a curious tone, "How much are we talking about?" Seeing that Enar didn't refuse and even seemed interested in the proposal, a smile appeared on Malakwa's parched and flabby lips. "Your Grace needs money for everything, be it to increase your armies or even to build fleets of ships. House Maegor is willing to pay 10 million honors. What I'm asking for is just the smallest of the litter." Malakwa finished with a big, proud smile on his face. He knew that asking for the strongest cub was unrealistic, but even the weakest cub was enough for him. Enar had expected a large number, but when he heard the absurd amount of money, he couldn't help but take a deep breath. What was the concept of 10 million honors? It was no different than 5 to 7 million golden dragons of Westeros. Enar knew that these houses descended from Valyria had profited greatly from the Volantis slave trade over more than 300 years, but he hadn't imagined it would be so much, and from Malakwa's proud expression, there was much more to it than met the eye. If it hadn't been for his self-control, Enar would have been laughing right now. He never thought that these Triarchs really thought themselves so untouchable that they could reveal such wealth without attracting anyone's attention. "Your Grace, House Penimian offers 10 million honors and 2,000 strong and healthy slaves." Donifos, seeing that Malakwa really could buy a dragon, hastily made an offer. As for the previous events, he had completely forgotten what it was like to kneel before a king. The possibility of owning a dragon was too tempting. Enar wondered how many people these people had sold to accumulate such wealth. That's at least 300 years of selling slaves and possibly much more. The Targaryen prince just wanted to storm the Black Walls and plunder the whole place. What was his motive? Did he need a motive? No, he didn't, but to maintain his saintly image, he needed a valid motive, and looking at the two Triarchs, Enar smiled mischievously. What king has never created a reason to steal and plunder other people's possessions? In England, English kings loved to steal church lands and parish wealth. What Enar was about to do was no different from that, but unlike the English kings, he wouldn't be robbing the church, but filthy slavers. Not only would Enar fill his coffers, but he would also sanctify his image in tens of millions of slaves across the continent of Essos. It was such a good thing that he almost felt unable to stop the smile from appearing on his lips. Honestly, he felt that the Triarchs had done him a great favor, and if it weren't for them being disgusting slavers, he might well spare them, but that was impossible. He would kill them all because he didn't want problems to arise in the future. An ant really can't kill an elephant, but a million ants is different. He left Ramsay alive only to destroy the Dreadfort in the future. Otherwise, he wouldn't have bothered to make that monster hate him. A hatred so great that it would make him kill all of House Bolton just to gain more power and take revenge on him. Unfortunately, Ramsay didn't know it, but he was acting according to Enar's wishes so that, in the end, the whole of House Bolton would serve as an example to the unruly lords of the north. Cruel? Enar didn't think he was cruel. He thought he was acting according to what the world was asking of him. He was just following the example of others for the greater benefit of House Targaryen. Seeing Enar in silence, Malakwa and Donifos were secretly anxious. They didn't think the price was enough to make the Targaryen prince accept the proposal. "Leda, what is the punishment for anyone who tries to assassinate the king?" Enar asked, causing many to look at him with puzzled looks. Only Daenerys, who knew Enar, smiled mischievously. Leda, although confused by her king's question, still answered with a respectful tone. "It depends on your Grace's orders, but generally beheading is the quickest option." "Then kill your king's murderers." Enar smiled and said with a playful tone, his purple eyes narrowed with a hint of amusement. Leda understood what Enar wanted and once again drew dawn from its scabbard. The sword came out of its sheath with a sharp slashing sound in the air, sending chills through the bodies of the two Triarchs of Volantis. Holding the sword in both hands, she walked towards the two Triarchs with a cold stare. Although what she was about to do was not an honorable act, she was not a knight being guided by the faith of the Seven. Her only god and king was Enar, and the god's orders were unquestionable. With every step she took, the colors on the faces of the two Triarchs faded. Their hearts seemed to explode with fear and nervousness. In the end, knowing their fate, they didn't beg but tried to run away. Which proved impossible in the next second. Their bodies were fixed in place, and no matter how much they wanted to, their bodies wouldn't respond to their commands. "Your Grace, don't kill me!" Seeing that it was impossible to escape, Malakwo tried to beg, snot and tears streaming down his old, wrinkled face. There was no trace of the mighty Triarch facing death, just another powerful old man who was terrified at the thought of dying. "Triarch, I'm going to tell you something important." Enar ignored the man's pleas and continued speaking. "The only thing that makes everyone human is death. You and your house have sold humans since the dawn of your existence, but in the end you and the slaves who carry your palanquins are no different in my eyes. You're just humans. Humans that you deprive of their freedom and sell as items. I will destroy and plunder everything that matters to you, and I will be recognized as a hero in the eyes of millions." Enar spoke every word without looking the man in the eye. A human like Malakwo wasn't even considered human in his eyes, unworthy of him looking him in the eye. Leda arrived in front of the two Triarchs and raised dawn. There was no suspense or epic scene, just the simple brutality of a sword decapitating heads with surprising ease. "Kinvara, go and spread the word that the Triarchs wanted to kill me and steal my dragons. Let the people be our sword to pierce those black walls." Enar looked down at Kinvara below the steps and spoke with an amused tone. "Yes, Your Grace." Kinvara replied with a smile on her face. She was going to enjoy what was about to happen. Just as Kinvara was about to leave and start spreading the rumors through the Emperor's daughters, she heard her king's voice again. "All the noble houses of the three Triarchs must be exterminated. I don't want even a speck of them to remain alive." Chapter 68, The Coronation, 3. Don't underestimate people's faith. Their self-centeredness can make real empires collapse under the weight of religion. Enar Targaryen thinking about the Bible on his lap. The news of the attempted assassination of the Son of Light, the Messiah of these people, the one who transformed their lives, brought freedom to the slaves and hope to the oppressed, aroused an overwhelming fury in the heart of every devout believer. For them, this was more than a crime. It was an unforgivable blasphemy against their faith. What followed was absolute chaos. Everything related to the old blood behind the black walls was stoned, destroyed, and vandalized. Popular anger took on such frightening proportions that even the most powerful trembled before it. Under the influence of Enar's manipulative doctrine, spread by his fanatical interpretation of the sacred scriptures, the people stopped acting like individuals. They became a sharp blade, ready to obey him without question. Under Bonero's orders, 20,000 of the Red Legion's 40,000 soldiers took to the streets, marching towards the imposing black walls. The gates, apparently impenetrable, proved useless in the face of internal treachery. Spies, disguised as slaves in the service of Valeria's descendants, turned against their masters without hesitation, seduced by the irresistible promise of sweet freedom. Note, I'll change the name of the Red Army to the Red Legion. 20,000 men stormed the black walls, entering a place reserved only for the descendants of Valeria and their slaves. What followed over the next few hours was a display of pure brutality, as cruel as it was ruthless. There was no looting or rape, just methodical extermination without discrimination. Men, women, the elderly and children all met a quick and painless death, the only form of mercy that Enar granted them, as he wished to eliminate any potential threat to his power in the future. The other noble houses descended from Valeria, observing the destruction, were gripped by absolute terror. After almost 300 years of complacency in their dreamlike dreams, they finally woke up to the harsh reality. For the first time, they understood that the world was not as glorious as they had imagined, and that they themselves were not as important as they had believed themselves to be. The false glory of ancient Valeria, which they had so revered and preserved, turned out to be as fragile as paper, easily torn and destroyed. Daenerys couldn't hide her dissatisfaction at the indiscriminate killing ordered by Enar, especially of children. Taking the lives of such innocent beings aroused a deep sense of desolation in her. They posed no threat, but were killed without hesitation by men who blindly followed Enar's orders. Not even the huge wagons crammed with gold and jewels, constantly entering the great temple of Volantis, brought any satisfaction. For Daenerys, those mountains of riches were stained with the blood of the innocent. Standing on the balcony of the king's room, she watched Volantis. Her eyes were fixed on the city, which was gradually being swallowed up by the gloom of night. "Are you sad?" Daenerys heard Enar's voice behind her, but she didn't turn to face him or answer his question. Sensing her indifference and aware that the massacre order still troubled his future queen, Enar smiled softly and positioned himself next to her on the balcony. "Of Malakwo's 4 children and countless grandchildren, all would eventually try to kill us," he said, his tone calm, his eyes lost in the endless timelines. "The cycle of hatred began the moment I killed the Triarch, and was brought to an end by destroying all of House Maegor." Enar raised his hand and with a delicate gesture grasped Daenerys' chin, directing her gaze to his. No matter how many generations passed, their hatred would take root in their blood. It would be passed down from father to son, from grandson to great-grandson. An endless cycle. He stroked her cheek with his fingers before continuing, his voice as gentle as a whisper. "I just saved us a lot of headaches in the future." Then he leaned down and placed a light kiss on the center of her forehead. Enar's touch and his words seemed to dissolve Daenerys' resistance. She let herself be enveloped by him, leaning her body against his and resting her head on his chest. Her turbulent feelings subsided, appeased by her blind trust in Enar. Knowing his ability to see into the future, she believed he was telling the truth. But although Enar hadn't lied, his explanation wasn't entirely true. There were descendants of House Maegor who didn't want revenge, who just wanted to live in peace. Yet he had ordered their hunting and execution. Why had he done so? Because, although it was a remote possibility, perhaps some descendant of Maegor would become a powerful figure, or even an apostle of some god, bringing trouble that could be avoided before it even began. "Daenerys, I want your help." Enar spoke, causing Daenerys to look at him with a hint of surprise reflecting in her eyes. "What is it, nephew?" Daenerys asked. "I can see the future. I've witnessed so many deaths that even if I lived 1,000 lifetimes I couldn't count them all." Enar spoke, his hand holding Daenerys' face lovingly. "Because of that, death is something banal to me and something I can order without any weight on my conscience. I could very well order the death of everyone in Volantis and feel absolutely nothing about it." Enar continued speaking in a soft tone. "Death for me has become as natural as breathing, so I want you, Visenya and Rhaenys, to be my light in this sea of darkness. Question me, fight with me, don't hesitate to speak your mind. Because my kingdom isn't just mine, it's ours." Daenerys felt her heart almost burst with emotion, the feelings inside her oscillating between deep anguish and intoxicating sweetness. Enar's words weighed on her in unexpected ways. On the one hand, she wanted to share the burden he carried. On the other, she found the trust he showed by including her in something so important incredibly sweet. She even chose to ignore the fact that Enar had mentioned Rhaenys. Kissing Enar's lips with a deep kiss, Daenerys ended the kiss with a feeling of reluctance and spoke with an incredibly determined tone. "Yes, I will never let you lose yourself and become a monster who only knows how to kill and destroy." Enar smiled and hugged Daenerys, both of them enjoying the cool late afternoon breeze that was gradually becoming colder. In Riella's room, the 3 women of House Targaryen were chatting animatedly. Visenya and Rhaenys, in particular, seemed to have formed an almost natural bond between them, which was surprising considering they had only met a few hours ago. "Why isn't Aunt Daenerys here?" asked Rhaenys, her voice laden with curiosity. Visenya replied in a casual tone, but there was a subtle hint of envy in her voice that didn't go unnoticed. "It's Dany's night to be with Enar." Rhaenys immediately regretted asking the question. Visenya, for her part, didn't seem to mind the discomfort she had caused. She liked sleeping cuddled up with Enar. That feeling of warmth, comfort and security in his arms was something she would never tire of. When she was with him, it seemed as if nothing in the world could hurt her. She deeply valued that feeling, given that she had never really felt safe once in her life. But Enar's arms could provide that feeling she had tried to want when she was growing up. "You share a bed with him on separate nights?" exclaimed Rhaenys, her voice laden with astonishment as she caught the implication in Visenya's words. The sudden realization struck her like a thunderbolt, the 2 of them were her own brother's lovers. Rhaenys had noticed their closeness in the throne room, but had never imagined that they had both become Enar's wives. "Yes, but we haven't consummated the marriage yet. I want to wait until after he becomes king," replied Visenya, her pale cheeks taking on a reddish hue at the mention of marriage. Although a smile remained on Rhaenys' face, inside she was consumed by anger and an intense feeling of possessiveness. She had been the first to meet Enar, the first to win his attention. Yet, in a matter of months, he had been taken from her, divided between others. How could she not feel this way? Riella, watching the conversation between her daughter and granddaughter, couldn't help but roll her eyes at the passing envy in Rhaenys' eyes. Visenya couldn't have noticed, but she, an experienced woman, did almost immediately. However, Riella said nothing. She was having fun watching this love triangle develop. Call it anything, but entertainment is rare in her life. Enar's coronation is in 2 days. Lady Kinvara has sent numerous dresses for us to choose from for the ceremony. Riella spoke, making the two young women's attention focus on her. Visenya's violet eyes sparkled as she listened to her mother's words. Obviously, they would be properly dressed for such an important occasion. Rhaenys wasn't immune to her grandmother's words either.
Look, if you've actually made it this far into the video and you're still here, come on then, hit subscribe. And honestly, if you think a friend of yours would like this, go on and share it with them. It really helps out. Right, I'm done. I'll get out of your hair now so you can get back to the good stuff. But seriously, stick around till the end. It's well worth it.
Chapter 69, The Coronation 4. Is he a man or a god? Yet just asking me the question makes me question reality. Tyrion Lannister, after meeting Enar Targaryen for the first time. "This city stinks like a sweaty old whore," commented Tyrion, watching the magnificent red towers burn in crimson flames. Even at night, Volantis seemed alive, which really pleased him. He supposed that the nights in the city were as lively as they promised to be. Apart from the imposing beard he now sported, Tyrion Lannister showed no major changes in appearance, nor any signs of torture. Barristan Selmy, to his surprise, had never hurt him or even threatened him. On the contrary, the old knight had provided him with food and water throughout the journey, without missing a single day. "Looks like we've arrived." Tyrion sighed as he walked beside the former Lord Commander of the Kingsguard, who had served both Aerys II and Robert I. The little lion of House Lannister had never considered running away during the journey. He knew that in Essos his father's name, although feared in Westeros, did not carry the same weight on this continent. Besides, the likelihood of dying while trying to escape was high. Even though he was aware that his final destination could be death, Tyrion preferred to live as long as possible under the protection of the legendary Knight of Westeros. "Ser Barristan, do you think the Targaryen prince will feed me to that dragon called Caraxes? Personally, I think it would be a waste of effort. I can't even fill the spaces between the beast's teeth." Tyrion commented with his characteristic acid humor. Although he feared death, he was determined to face it if the future Dragon King so wished. Barristan fixed his blue eyes on the dwarf, giving him a deep look before replying, "I'll try to speak on your behalf. You're not a monster like your father." Throughout the journey, Barristan had come to realize that Tyrion was a good-hearted man. Despite his short stature and the reputation he carried, he had more honor and dignity than many self-proclaimed knights. Even though he knew that defending Tyrion could cost him his life, the old knight would do it, because he didn't want the dwarf's fate to be sealed by his hands. Tyrion smiled, even in the face of the circumstances. The two of them had become friends over the course of the journey. "Thank you, Ser Barristan. If you survive, I hope you'll pour the best wine you can find over my tombstone." Yes, Tyrion didn't think he would come out of this alive. The pain that House Lannister had inflicted on House Targaryen went far beyond destroying a dynasty. His father had ordered the murder of the entire royal family and, in the end, succeeded. In all, at least 4 members of House Targaryen perished at the hands of the Lannisters. Tyrion never imagined that he would pay with his life for Tywin's actions. Still, he had one last wish, that the Targaryen king would not be cruel and would spare his nephews. Myrcella and Tommen didn't deserve such a tragic fate. They were too young to die. "What's happening to this city?" Barristan muttered to himself, noticing that the air in the city was slightly hostile. It was an atmosphere that reminded him of war. Approaching an old man sitting in front of a house, calmly smoking a pipe, Barristan decided to look for answers. "Hello, can you tell me what's going on in town?" What came out of the former Lord Commander's mouth was a high Valyrian tainted with Esso's accents, surprising even Tyrion. The old man, with a fly tattoo on his cheek, looked at the tall knight and the dwarf with curiosity. After letting out a long puff of smoke, he replied, "The Triarchs tried to steal and kill the Messiah's dragons. The people revolted and the Red Legion stormed the Black Walls." He paused to take another drag, releasing another thick cloud before continuing. "There was a massacre behind the Black Walls. After that, hundreds, maybe thousands of carriages left laden with gold and precious jewels." There was a hint of pleasure in his voice at the mention of the massacre of the old bloods of Valyria. As a slave who collected elephant and horse dung, he was more than happy to see what had happened. There wasn't a good person behind the Black Walls. Those people didn't even consider them human. "Is the prince hurt?" Barristan asked, concern evident on his face. Just the thought that his future king might have suffered an assassination attempt made the former Lord Commander of the Royal Guard immediately want to run towards the great temple of Volantis. The old man shook his head firmly. "The Messiah is fine. He was protected by Lady Leda Dane, who killed those damn Triarchs," he replied with a tone full of sincere devotion. It wasn't difficult to understand the reverence in his words. He was no longer a slave, and thanks to the Messiah, his children and grandchildren were also free from this cursed fate. Now his grandchildren could study, and his family finally had hope of escaping poverty. All thanks to the Messiah, who had put an end to the slave trade in Volantis. Even knowing that Slave Bay was furious and planning to send a fleet against Volantis, the old man didn't care. On the contrary, he fervently wanted to see those slavers burn in the sacred flames of the Messiah's dragon. Barristan breathed a sigh of relief when he heard that the prince was safe, but then a name caught his attention. Lady Leda Dane. He searched his memories and soon remembered. The girl was the niece of Arthur Dane, the legendary comrade in arms he had respected so much. "If you've come for the Messiah's coronation, I advise you to find an inn as soon as possible. People are arriving from all over the continent. Volantis will be packed tomorrow." Noticing Barristan's obvious concern for the Messiah's safety, the old man's expression softened. He decided to offer some gentle advice to those travelers who had clearly come from very far away. "Thank you," said Barristan in a sincere tone as he turned to leave. The old man, letting out another puff of smoke, murmured kindly, "God bless you, travelers from afar." Tyrion watched the people around him, some praying while hiding their faces under black robes. He shook his head slightly and commented, "I don't know how, but these people really do worship him as if he were a god." "And what does it matter?" Barristan replied, continuing to walk ahead without looking away from the faithful. "It matters," Tyrion replied, with his usual cunning tone. "Because, tell me, what do you think is the mentality of someone who is worshipped as a god?" Barristan frowned for a moment, pondering his words. In the end, his mind came up with an answer he didn't want to believe. Seeing Barristan's silence, Tyrion sighed, but made no comment. The answer was obvious to everyone. A true tyrant. Noticing his silence, Tyrion spoke in a more cheerful tone. "Maybe I'm wrong. Look how these people love and treat Prince Enar with respect. A tyrant may have the fear of the people, but a tyrant will never have the love of the people." Barristan's expression improved hearing those words. Yes, his prince had won the love of these people. He would not be an unworthy king. Tyrion could guess Barristan's thoughts from the legendary knight's expression, but unlike the optimistic knight, he wasn't so keen to find Enar Targaryen. There was another option he hadn't mentioned. Every tyrant had the love of the people in the beginning. "So, do you want to go straight to the great temple of Volantis, or shall we look for an inn? I'd love to have one last meal. And if it were in the arms of a beautiful woman from Volantis, it would be even more incredible," Tyrion commented with a smile on his face. "You are truly lascivious, Lord Tyrion." Barristan shook his head in disbelief at the dwarf's lust. It was hard for him to understand how someone so small could carry such a huge appetite. It wasn't the first time that Tyrion had asked him for a prostitute, although perhaps it would be the last. Not everyone has vows of celibacy. "I honestly don't know how you can go decades without feeling the warmth of a woman," Tyrion replied, rolling his eyes at the knight's seriousness. "Duty, honor, responsibility," replied Barristan without hesitation, as if the words were engraved on his soul. "You have my sincerest admiration." I, however, couldn't do it. Being away from a woman for a month would make me feel dead inside, Tyrion commented, with an amused tone and a teasing smile. Chapter 70, The Coronation v. A mother's love is precious, thank your mother for having it, many don't. Tyrion Lannister, looking at a painting of his mother at the age of 12. Looking at the field of winter flowers before him, Enar felt at peace. Surrounded by blue flowers, he allowed himself a moment of tranquility. However, a presence behind him interrupted his serenity. There was something or someone behind him. The air carried the scent of winter flowers, a slightly sweet, faint and delicate smell. Turning around, Enar came across a young woman. She looked no older than 16. Her long black hair framed a delicate face, and her gray eyes, deep and naturally free, reminded him of a wolf. Enar held his breath at the sight of her. Yes, he had to find her before he became king. Otherwise, he would never find peace. What he was about to do would tear through the continent of Westeros like a butcher's knife. Lyanna looked at the tall young man in front of her and couldn't contain her surprise. He looked incredibly like her husband, so much so that for a moment she thought that perhaps Rhaegar had a twin brother. However, something sparked in her memory, and her face revealed a stunned expression. Despite her trembling legs, Lyanna stepped forward and held his face with both hands. "Enar?" she asked, her voice trembling with the incredulity of the moment. "How did you find out?" Enar asked, curious. Apart from his appearance, there were no clues linking him to her. After all, Lyanna had only held him for a few seconds before death overtook her. "Your eyes, your beautiful eyes," Lyanna replied, as she hugged him tightly, as if she never wanted to let go. "I'm sorry, I'm really sorry for not being by your side. I'm sorry I didn't hold you when you were sad. I'm sorry for not comforting you when you needed it most. There are so many I'm sorrys that I can never forgive myself." Every word Lyanna uttered carried an immense weight of sadness and regret. "Don't worry, I never blamed you for anything." Enar wrapped Lyanna's trembling figure in a hug and replied in a gentle, serene voice. "I just thank you for bringing me into the world." For him as a son, it mattered little that Lyanna and Rhaegar's actions had led to the ruin of House Targaryen in Westeros. No dynasty was eternal, but his would be. With a delicate gesture, Enar lifted Lyanna's face, making her look at him, and spoke in the softest tone he could manage. "Because of that, you are the best mother in the world." The 16-year-old stared at him, stunned. She had never imagined hearing something like this from her son, especially after leaving him behind, without a mother or father, to protect himself. "Really? You don't think I'm a horrible mother?" Lyanna asked, struggling to believe what she had just heard. Enar smiled, finding her reaction charming. She didn't look like a married woman, but rather a girl still unprepared for motherhood. "How could I blame you? I saw you bring me into the world, even knowing the difficulties of childbirth. I saw you kiss my forehead and wish me safe, even in your last breath. There's nothing you do that could make me hate you." Enar's words brimmed with pride, making it clear how much he admired Lyanna. Tears streamed uncontrollably down her face. Lyanna tried to wipe them away, but they seemed inexhaustible. Patiently, Enar hugged her again, helping her to calm down. As he gently wiped away some of the tears on his mother's face, he spoke in a gentle tone. "I will be crowned king in a few minutes, and after the coronation my wedding will take place." Enar's words made Lyanna's eyes widen. She had barely met her son and now he was going to be taken by a woman she didn't even know. Sensing the dissatisfaction on his mother's face, Enar almost laughed, but remained serious as he continued. "I will be crowned in Volantis. Then I'll invade Westeros in full force. I will tear that continent in half, bringing death, fear and hope to those people." Lyanna's gaze quickly changed to concern. It wasn't the war itself that frightened her, but the possibility of losing her son to it. Rhaegar had said goodbye in a similar way and he had never returned. Ever since, she had hated goodbyes. "Why don't you stay in Volantis and rule the city?" Lyanna tried to persuade him, but the determination in Enar's eyes silenced her. The words she wanted to say were stuck on her lips. She recognized that look. It was the same look Rhaegar had when he had decided something irrevocable. "Why do you have to act like your stupid father? I should have listened to Elia and beaten Rhaegar unconscious in a saddle." Lyanna muttered to herself, her expression laden with regret. If she had done that, her husband would still be alive, and the chances of her son still being a prince would be much greater. Enar's lips twitched unnaturally when he heard his mother's whisper. He knew that Lyanna was not an easy woman, but he hadn't imagined that she would be so bold. And from her words it seemed that Queen Elia shared a similar mindset. He wondered how his father had managed to deal with two seemingly gentle women with impressive ferocity. As he reflected, Enar felt someone trying to rouse him and knew that the coronation was about to begin. Enar smiled confidently and replied, "I'm going, mother." "Will we meet again?" Lyanna asked with a reluctant expression, clearly dreading the separation. She wanted to be with him forever, protecting him as a mother, making sure he wasn't deceived by some woman with bad intentions. "Yes, I'll send your conscience to visit two incredible women," Enar replied with a soft laugh. The thought of his mother next to Queen Visenya I and Queen Rhaenys I brought him a pleasant feeling. He knew that the three women would get along very well. Before Lyanna could say anything, Enar leaned over and kissed her forehead tenderly. She felt her consciousness slowly fade, but her last sight was of her son's gentle face. When he opened her eyes, Enar was back in the room. He was still sitting in the chair where he had fallen asleep. In front of him, Visenya was looking at him with concern. "Are you tired, Enar? Do you want to postpone the coronation for a few hours?" Visenya asked, her voice laden with tenderness, the concern clearly evident in her gaze. "No, it was just a dream I needed to have before I was crowned," Enar replied as he stood up. His clothes, carefully prepared, were the definition of luxury. He wore an entirely red suit. 2 Valyrian steel rings adorned his ring fingers. His hair, which usually fell over his shoulders, was combed back, highlighting his face. A dark doublet with the red coat of arms of House Targaryen embroidered on the chest hugged his body tightly, and he wore black leather gloves. Lady Lya, his sword, was firmly sheathed at his waist. He exuded an elegant aura, regal yet capable of making anyone unable to look away from him. At that moment he was the sun and all the others were planets orbiting around him. Even Visenya, used to Enar's presence and beauty, couldn't help but be mesmerized. If there was anyone worthy of the title of king, it was him. Enar was the embodiment of what everyone imagined as an ideal ruler. "Am I presentable, my queen?" Enar asked in an amused tone, noticing the intense, passionate look she was giving him. It fed his ego. After all, what man wouldn't want to be looked at like that by his wife? "You look perfect. You'll charm all the women here," Visenya replied, but Enar caught a note of jealousy in her voice. He laughed, a low, magnetic laugh, his voice tinged with kindness. "Believe me, you look more stunning than ever." He wasn't lying. Visenya was wearing a red and gold dress that hugged her slender body perfectly, highlighting her delicate curves. Her hair was tied up in an impeccable bun, while a necklace adorned with rubies glittered on her graceful neck. "I'll make sure I don't gouge out the eyes of the men who look at you with lust," Enar joked, a touch of humor in his voice, drawing a laugh from Visenya. "No blood on your coronation day," Visenya replied as she carefully adjusted a detail of her clothing, making sure everything was perfect. "I won't promise that won't happen." Enar laughed, wondering if there was a madman who would get in the way of his coronation. There was nothing in the prescience that had shown that, but he had never trusted the prescience entirely. As he watched millions of timelines, he understood that fate was unpredictable and he could only navigate the calmest waters with the help of his skill. Chapter 71, The Coronation 6. I told you, faith is a scary thing when used as a weapon. Enar Targaryen, God Emperor of Planetos. On leaving the room with Visenya, Enar found Leda, Titus, Sigismund and Ser Willem, all dressed in white armor and equally white cloaks. Although Titus and Sigismund were not members of the royal guard, but of the dreaded Sardaukar, they were charged with protecting him and his family with unwavering devotion. Walking down the corridor, Enar found Daenerys, clearly more nervous than the prince himself who was to be crowned in a few moments. She wore a black dress with red sleeves, while her hair was tied up in a bun similar to Visenya's, but adorned with glittering jewels that further highlighted her elegance. Both queens were impeccably dressed, looking stunning for what would be the second most important occasion of their lives. "I'm grateful to have two such beautiful queens," Enar commented, watching as they both positioned themselves next to him, Visenya on his left and Daenerys on his right. Daenerys smiled happily despite her nervousness and reciprocated with a sincere compliment. "My king is even more handsome." Noticing Daenerys' anxiety, Enar rolled his eyes and joked, "Don't be so nervous. If anything, ask Balerion to burn what you're worried about." The mention of her dragon brought a smile to Daenerys' lips. Remembering the vigilant, protective cub who was always by her side reassured her a little. Taking a deep breath, Enar held out her hands to Visenya and Daenerys. "Come on, people are waiting." He spoke, feeling the firm touch of the two as they held his hands. With a determined stride, the king's guard followed close behind, hands poised on the hilt of their swords, alert for any threat. Arriving at the end of the corridor, Enar didn't even have to be near the square in front of the great temple of Volantis to hear the thunderous sound of hundreds of thousands of people. It was like the roar of a gigantic monster, a living force that seemed to pulsate in the air. He squeezed Visenya and Daenerys' hands lightly. "It looks like they're anxious to see us. But I don't blame them, I'm so handsome it's a sin." He joked, drawing laughter from both of them. "I don't know how you managed to make me laugh in this situation. My heart is almost bursting out of my chest." Daenerys commented, her voice calmer now. "What can I say? I have the gift." Enar boasted, maintaining his confident posture. He knew he needed to be calm enough to be the foundation for everyone around him. With a more serious tone, he whispered to both of them, "Also, don't be afraid. Fear kills the soul and erodes determination." They both rolled their eyes, but they couldn't deny that, thanks to him, they were calmer. The nervousness was still there, but the fear had disappeared. When Enar entered the square, he came across a monumental stage 3 meters high. In front of it, a crowd pressed in, so dense that he estimated at least 40,000 people near the stage, while hundreds of thousands more crowded the surrounding streets, eagerly awaiting the prince's speech. In the side stands set up for high-status guests were important figures from Volantis, including his sister, Rhaenys, the Dowager Queen, Rhaella I Targaryen, the entire House Martell and religious leaders such as Banero and Makoro. On the stage, only Kinvara was waiting. The woman wore a red silk dress, with a large veil that hid her face, almost touching the floor. As Reverend Mother of the Red Faith in Essos, her presence commanded absolute respect. As Enar climbed the steps, silence overtook the square. Each step seemed to echo in place, making the atmosphere strangely silent. Everyone was waiting for the arrival of the prophet, the Messiah of Essos. As soon as he reached the stage, the silence was broken by deafening shouts. Requests for forgiveness and cries mixed in a cacophony that made the whole place shake. Not only Enar but Visenya, Daenerys and the Kingsguard also took to the stage. The Kingsguard strategically positioned themselves to protect the 3 members of House Targaryen. Enar stopped next to Kinvara, looking down at the sea of people below. Some held out their hands as if begging for a blessing. The crowd didn't see him as a mere mortal, but as a messiah, someone capable of leading them to paradise after death. Watching the scene, Enar couldn't help but think, the Bible really was the most effective indoctrination tool on the planet, without a doubt. Enar raised his hand and closed his fist. The moment he did so, the noise ceased completely, replaced by silence. "Before we begin, pray with me." Enar spoke, his voice gentle and warm, making many think they were seeing a god, especially with the sunlight behind him making a halo of light around him. Strangely, his voice was heard by all 40,000 people in the square, and he didn't need to speak to the rest, as they were being passed on by the believers themselves. Since Enar wanted to create a theocratic empire, he had to start with the people. In this empire, he would be the god of the people and no one else. Enar began the prayer himself. "Our Father who art in heaven." Everyone continued praying after Enar, a holy choir of truly devout people who had been given a new lease of life because of Enar. "Hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come. Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven." The sound of the people had intensified, so that all of Volantis could hear the prayer of hundreds of thousands of people together. "Give us this day our daily bread. And forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us." The impact that this prayer had on some people could no longer be described as unbelievable, it was simply shocking in the extreme. "And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Amen." Enar finished the prayer and made the sign of the cross, which everyone below followed. Taking a deep breath, Enar began his speech without beating around the bush. "My people, brothers and sisters, all who have come from the 9 free cities, you grace me with your noble presence on this day. A day that will be remembered in eternity, where you all shared the same glories with me. The same destiny, the same life, the same purpose. It will not be glory, wealth or power that will take us to paradise, but I who will take you. I will bear all your sins, I will bless you, I will endure you for the sins you have committed. All I ask in return is simple. Treat me as your father and I will take you in as my children. If you have me in your hearts, I will have you in my heart, just as God has commanded me to do. God bless you. As I finish, I raise my hand up and clench my fist tightly. He didn't need many words, everyone already adored him, he just had to give them one more reason to give their lives to him if he asked them to. If before these people, who had lived in precarious situations all their lives, had worshipped Enar as a holy being, who had lifted them out of poverty by giving them jobs and homes, then now these people were no longer people, but fanatics who had been seduced by Enar with monstrous mastery. Messiah, the one who will guide us. Son of Light. Loud shouts rang out after the brief end of Enar's speech. Everyone raised their hands and clenched their fists, imitating Enar. Riella felt her heart beating faster, her ears ringing with the deafening sound of tens of thousands shouting at the same time as she watched, simply shocked at all the people worshipping her grandson as genuinely as if they had seen a god. For a moment she really felt that her grandson was a god, not a mortal like her or anyone else, but Riella soon pushed these absurd thoughts to the back of her mind. However, it made her realize how terrible Enar's charm was. Her grandson could convert an entire city with one speech, which was completely unbelievable to say the least. Riella didn't know it, but all of Kinvara, Banero and Enar's nearly 6 years of planning had gone into this moment. It wasn't overnight that these people began to love Enar, it was a natural process, just as a seed takes time to germinate. All to result in this moment that Enar saw with his prescience when he was 6 years old, when he met Kinvara for the first time. Chapter 72, The Coronation, 7. Thinking that my father will die because of my king, I feel a little mercy for him, but when I remember what he did for me, that mercy disappears as if it had never existed. Tyrion Lannister, the Hand of the King, watching the nearly 1,000 warships. Kinvara looked at the people revering their messiah and felt that all the work of years had paid off, all the sweat, blood and determination spent. At that moment, Volantis became a true theocratic city. Enar gestured for everyone to be silent, and they were. Kinvara, begin the coronation, he said in a calm tone. Kinvara nodded and removed her long veil, revealing her face for all to see, which provoked a few shouts of reverence in the background. Ignoring the voices, she focused entirely on Enar and nothing else. God has given you the divine right to rule, and as he has commanded, my prince will be the king he promised. He will free the heretics from their barbarian gods and lead the unbelievers to true salvation. Kinvara paused and looked at the crowd, asking aloud, "Is anyone against the words of God?" The silence that followed in the crowd made Kinvara nod with satisfaction. Under everyone's shocked gazes, she waved her hand, and fire began to gather on her. In the end, a crown of flames appeared in her hands. As Kinvara was short, Enar had to lean forward a little, allowing the Reverend Mother to place the crown of fire on her head. Surprisingly, the crown of fire, whose flame seemed alive and burned fiercely, didn't hurt Enar, which provoked exclamations of surprise from the crowd. Enar Targaryen, first of his name, Knight of Caraxes, King of the Undulls, the Rhoynars and the First Men, Lord of the Seven Kingdoms and Protector of the Realm, Father of Dragons, Son of the Light of Volantis, the Promised King, Destroyer of the greatest Khalasar of his time. At Kinvara's words, the crowd bowed until their foreheads touched the ground, responding in whispers. He who was prophesied. The Messiah. The Prophet of Essos. The whispers built up as the crowd remained kneeling, repeating words full of hope for the future. Tyrion watched the man wearing a crown of pure fire on the stage and couldn't help feeling that he was seeing a character straight out of an Age of Heroes Westeros book. He was really worried about his sweet nephew and niece at that moment. Knowing the Red Faith's tradition of burning people alive, he assumed that this could be their fate and would probably be his too. Still, he had to admit, the young Targaryen king had an overwhelming charisma, worthy of a king destined to found a dynasty. Tyrion wanted to serve such a king, someone whose name would be etched in history as a true conqueror. However, when he remembered the noble house into which he had been born, he knew that his dream was impossible. Suddenly, the next move sent a shiver through his small body. The young king's purple eyes fell on him, and an amused smile played across his lips. Tyrion swallowed, and even though he thought it was impossible and that it was just a coincidence, he felt that the Targaryen king recognized him. Enar, looking at Tywin Lannister's legendary knight and dwarf, was incredibly amused to see the frightened expression of the king's future advisor. He would give Tyrion Lannister a good reason to bend the knee and serve him body and soul. Looking at the sea of people kneeling before him, Enar smiled. It was the first step of true reconquest. He would leave Essos in a year and a half, docking at Porto Branco in the north with his fleet of ships, which was still being built to transport his tens of thousands of troops. Kinvara, order food to be delivered to these people. They must all be starving, having spent hours waiting for me. Enar, still with the crown of flames on his hair, looked at the Reverend Mother, who was staring at him with a fanatical gleam in her eyes, and spoke in a regal tone. "Your decree will be fulfilled, Your Grace," Kinvara replied as she bowed to Enar, who then approached Visenya and Daenerys. "When I am crowned in Westeros, you will be crowned with me as my queens. I will be magnanimous and let the people see their beautiful queens." Holding both women's hands, Enar commented in a gentle tone. "Don't worry, my king." Holding Enar's hand firmly, Visenya responded with flushed cheeks. The vision of Enar's coronation was still vivid in her mind, a moment she would never forget. "We're not sad, just emotional. This is the first step towards House Targaryen rising from the ashes and ruins." Daenerys nodded. She saw no need for a coronation at the moment. She would rather wait until she reached King's Landing and became queen like all the sovereigns who had come before her. "Let's go to the banquet, I want to see what presents I get." Enar commented as he flashed a smile. He really was looking forward to some presents. Hearing Enar's words, Visenya and Daenerys looked at each other and saw the curiosity in each other's eyes. They knew that every time her future husband showed that expression, something interesting would happen next. Enar was sitting on the throne in the center above the steps, with Daenerys and Visenya sitting respectively to his right and left. Rhaenys couldn't help feeling jealous seeing how partial he was to his wives, leaving her aside. Looking at the Dark Sister placed next to her seat, the possession of the legendary sword didn't bring as much happiness as she had previously imagined. Seeing the interaction between Enar, Daenerys and Visenya left a bitter taste in her mouth. Suddenly, Rhaenys heard her cousin's voice next to her. "If you carry on like this, you'll be left out." Looking at Arianne, who was gazing at her with an enigmatic smile, Rhaenys turned up her caution to maximum. If there was one thing she had learned in Dorne, it was that Arianne could be many things, but kind and charitable was certainly not one of them. The heiress of Sunspear had always given her the impression that she could do anything to get what she wanted. "What do you mean, cousin?" Despite the wariness she felt, Rhaenys didn't let it show on her face. Learning to hide her emotions was a gift she had learned. "Do you think you're being subtle? A blind man could see that you're looking at him lustfully." Arianne popped a grape into her mouth and replied with a sensual tone. Her cat-like gaze made Rhaenys look at her cousin with a deep look. "If you carry on like this, he'll have children and you'll be left behind in this battle, dear cousin." Arianne swallowed the grape and licked the remnants of the fruit's juice off her fingers with a sensual look. Rhaenys couldn't help but snort at her words, but deep down she agreed with Arianne's words, but she still felt insecure. "Do you think he'll only have 2 wives?" Arianne asked with an amused tone. "When he takes more wives, Princess Visenya and Daenerys have teamed up to secure their rights. What do you think will happen to the latecomers?" Arianne looked like a demon seducing its prey, tempting it to commit sins. Rhaenys didn't have to think too hard about what would happen when the scenario Arianne spoke of eventually came to pass. It will be a battle between Enar's wives for power at court, the king's attention and time in his bed. Whoever has a child the fastest will be the one with the greatest importance, as the heir or heiress will have come from her womb. At that moment, Rhaenys could see that other nobles chose who to support in order to gain more benefits. Honestly, nothing unusual for a court. "What do you want, Arianne?" Rhaenys didn't call Arianne cousin, she spoke her name directly, showing that both women were negotiating and not having a conversation between relatives. "I want in." Arianne was direct and didn't hide her years-long purpose. Rhaenys was not at all surprised. Then she remembered that unlike the Sand Snakes, Arianne had never been seen sharing a bed with a man. "Is that why you stayed a virgin?" Rhaenys couldn't help but speak with a touch of sarcasm, but she didn't understand why Arianne would prepare for so long. She was the heir of Sunspear. "I found out that my father doesn't plan to keep me as heir, he prefers a man on the throne of Dorne." Arianne spoke in a casual tone, but Rhaenys noticed a touch of coldness when she mentioned her own father. "If he doesn't want to give me what's rightfully mine, I'll take it by force." Rhaenys understood everything by listening to those words, but in the end she didn't refuse Arianne's offer. If they had it together, they would be able to take on the two queens of Enar. If you marry Enar and not the other way around, you will lose your right to the throne of Dorne. Rhaenys warned with a touch of curiosity. If Enar married Arianne, he would be Arianne's consort, and something like that was impossible for a king. I don't plan on marrying him, just being his mistress. As long as I have a silver-haired, purple-eyed boy or girl, everything will be fine. Arianne spoke with a sensual tone, watching Enar on the throne. She had a mortal weakness for handsome men, and the king's beauty was really taking her breath away. Careful, Arianne, you're playing with fire. If you betray Enar, it won't be him who kills you, but Daenerys and Visenya. I realize that they protect Enar and will kill you if you betray him with another man. Rhaenys warned Arianne with a serious look. Do you think I'm a fool? I wouldn't trade Enar for 1,000 handsome men. He will be my greatest support in my government. Arianne rolled her eyes at Rhaenys' useless warning. Enar would be the pillar for her to control Dorne, even though her father had decreed Quentyn to be his heir. How could she lose all her power because of one man? Seeing this, Rhaenys relaxed. With Arianne's words, she didn't have to worry about being implicated if something like that happened. I accept, let's go together. Rhaenys whispered to Arianne, who raised her glass for a toast. Rhaenys picked up her own wine glass and both glasses clashed in the air. We'll be allies. Arianne smiled and spoke with a happy tone. Chapter 73 Conspiracies. I'm going to turn into dragon dung. Tyrion Lannister thought, seeing the king's eyes staring at him with a cold gaze. Daenerys and Visenya were unaware of the alliances that were beginning to form. The two were chatting amusingly with Enar about various subjects when the guests began to file in, bringing offerings of gold, jewels, armor, and weapons. The weapons and armor, although of excellent quality, were nowhere near the supremacy of Valyrian steel. Still, they were remarkable pieces that Enar would give to his most valiant soldiers, those who had contributed decisively in the war against the Dothraki. However, Enar's attention was caught by one guest in particular, a tall man with amber skin, dark red hair, and wearing a yellowish tunic. But what really piqued the king's interest was not the man's distinctive appearance, but the gift he brought. 10 boxes crammed with gold and jewels. These were no ordinary boxes, but huge containers, each 1 meter in diameter. Enar quickly calculated. The contents must have amounted to around 30,000 gold coins, not counting the jewels. An impressive gift, especially considering that other guests offered an average of 1,000 gold coins. Sensing Enar's attentive gaze, the man leaned in slightly and introduced himself in the common tongue. I am Hisdar zo Lora, descendant of Mazdan the Magnificent, Hazrak the Beautiful, and Zerak the Liberator. He continued, his voice marked by a tone of reverence. It is an honor to meet you, Your Grace. I hope my gift was worthy of your appreciation. Hisdar turned his gaze to the throne, where Enar stood imposingly. The crown of flames was burning on his head, but it didn't seem to cause him any pain. On the contrary, it gave him an air of divinity, as if he were blessed by the fire itself. Enar answered sincerely. Thank you for the gifts, Hisdar zo Lora. Although his fortune had grown enormously after the sacking of the Old Blood behind the Black Walls, Enar knew that money was never too much, especially when it came to building an army, especially a large army like his that needed lots of ships and food. The purpose of Hisdar's visit, however, was what interested Enar most. According to information from the Emperor's daughters, the 3 slave cities were uniting to besiege Volantis. The interruption in the flow of slaves to Slavers Bay had enraged the elites of these cities, leaving them thirsting for retaliation. I would like you to answer my questions, Lord Hisdar, said Enar, his firm voice echoing through the hall and capturing everyone's attention. Why are you in Volantis? As I understand it, the cities of Astapor, Meereen, and Yunkai are, at this very moment, forming an alliance to besiege my beautiful city, bringing their fleet of ships and armies of slaves. Everyone's eyes turned to Hisdar, some filled with coldness, others with a deadly glare. Despite this, the amber-skinned man's face remained impassive, expressing no emotion or surprise at Enar's doubts. I don't share the same resentment as them, Your Grace, replied Hisdar, his voice calm and controlled. He spoke with cautious respect, avoiding any tone that might irritate the young king in front of him. The blood feud between Valyria and Guise ended a long time ago. Enar leaned back slightly in his throne, a smile forming on his lips. He remained silent for a moment, but internally he found those words absurd. The idea that the feud between Valyria and Guise was over was laughable. It was no secret that Valyria had destroyed the Guy's empire to its ashes. If there wasn't still deep hatred in Slavers Bay today, Enar would be the first to point out the lie. He himself harbored a desire to destroy the last remnants of new Guys, those who dreamed of restoring the old empire in the present day. And Hisdar? Enar knew that this man, with his quiet demeanor and careful words, was much more than he seemed. He was one of the secret princes of New Guys, linked to the powerful Iron Legions, a force inspired by the lockstep legions of Old Guys. "I would like to request a private conversation, Your Grace," Hisdar spoke with a careful tone. The cold, hostile looks on his face intensified. Kinvara and Banero in particular seemed ready to pounce. To them, that man was only in Volantis to buy time for Slavers Bay. However, no one dared to act. The decision was up to Enar, not them. "Very well, we will have a private meeting," Lord Hisdar replied. Enar, with an enigmatic smile as his eyes narrowed in thought. If Hisdar wished to take part in the Game of Thrones, Enar saw no problem in including one more player. The more pieces on the board, the greater the triumph at the end. Deep down, Enar was sure that by defeating all his opponents and rising as emperor, his name would not only be legendary, but would become divine, as the ruler who controlled the entire planet. Hisdar, oblivious to the fate that awaited him, gave a relieved smile when he heard Enar's agreement. "Thank you, Your Grace," said Hisdar, stepping back to make room for the other guests. It was at this moment that Riella, who had been watching the visitors attentively, stood up abruptly at the sight of an elderly man walking towards Enar with a dwarf by his side. Ser Barristan? How could she not recognize her husband and brother's former member of the royal guard? Although Ares was a terrible king, his royal guard was legendary, made up of knights like Barristan the Bold, Arthur Dane, the Sword of the Morning, and Gerald Hightower, the White Bull. When Barristan saw the former queen, healthy and in perfect condition, his countenance was filled with relief. There were two great regrets that tormented him, not having protected Rhaegar and not having acted when King Ares abused his own wife. Kneeling before the steps of the throne, Barristan raised his eyes to Enar, who wore a crown of flames. The resemblance between father and son did not go unnoticed by him. "I am Barristan Selmy, Your Grace, Lord Commander of your father's guard," Barristan declared firmly, without hesitation, in front of Enar and the queens at the young king's side. The moment he revealed his identity, Leda, who was standing in front of the steps, drew the sword Dawn from its scabbard and placed the blade against the knight's neck. Her grey eyes, cold as steel, stared mercilessly at the traitor. "And Lord Commander of Robert Baratheon," Leda added, her words laden with contempt. If it hadn't been for the need to wait for Enar's orders, Barristan's head would have been rolling on the floor by now. Whispers rang through the hall at the old knight's words. The surprise was evident among the guests, who murmured amongst themselves, unable to hide their astonishment at the turn of events. Everyone there knew the history of House Targaryen, a basic knowledge for any visitor wishing to avoid death for saying something inappropriate in front of the king. Daenerys and Visenya, overcome by the initial shock, exchanged deep glances, trying to process the scene before them. Even though they didn't want to, they couldn't help a feeling of anger welling up in their hearts. Rhaenys was also perplexed, although her memories of the old knight were vague. She remembered being carried on his shoulders as they walked through the courtyard, one of the rare happy memories of her childhood. "And why is the Lord Commander of my cousin's royal guard here, kneeling before me?" Enar asked, even though he already knew the answer. He had no intention of killing Barristan. What fool would eliminate one of the most powerful knights in the world? Enar had bigger plans for him. Barristan in the royal guard would be an invaluable asset, and together with his vast combat experience after undergoing physical enhancement, he would become a veritable war machine. "I ask the king to accept my service in the royal guard. My sword will be yours until the end of my days," Barristan replied without hesitation. His blue eyes locked onto Enar's with determination. Dawn's blade at his neck did not intimidate him, his expression remained unchanged. Enar watched him in silence, his violet eyes locked on the old knight's resolute gaze. The hall fell silent. No one dared to speak, awaiting the young king's judgment. It was Oberyn who broke the silence. "My king, if I may speak, I advise you to accept Barristan Selmy. The weight of his name alone is worth 1,000 men." He paused before adding, "Accepting Barristan will send a powerful message to the noble houses of Westeros that the king is magnanimous." Enar knew Oberyn was right. Many houses had sworn loyalty to Robert Baratheon and feared that Enar would eliminate all those who had betrayed the Targaryens. Accepting Barristan would be an excellent move to show that the noble houses that had betrayed him were allowed to continue to exist. It would make many noble houses still undecided come over to Enar's side without much effort. "Thank you for your advice, Prince Oberyn," said Enar in a sincere tone, drawing a smile from the prince. After long minutes of contemplation, Enar finally spoke. "Put your sword away and step back, Leda." Without hesitation, Leda returned Dawn to its scabbard, stepping back with a cutting glance at Barristan. "I will allow you to serve me, but not in the royal guard." "I still don't trust you," Enar declared. Before he could continue, he noticed his grandmother, Riella, asking for permission to speak. "My king, I would like Barristan to serve me as my guard," Riella said firmly. Her statement surprised Barristan, who stared at her with wide eyes. He had never imagined that the Dowager Queen would accept him, especially after everything that had happened. Enar looked at her grandmother and smiled. "All right, I'll allow it. He will serve you, grandmother." "Thank you, your grace. You won't regret it," Barristan said with a relieved look on his face. He would finally serve a worthy king. Still kneeling, Barristan gestured to the side, drawing attention to another man next to him. "Your grace, this next to me is Tyrion of House Lannister." Chapter 74, Conspiracies 2. "You may not want to fight, but I want you to fight." Enar Targaryen, watching his ministers fight each other, balancing the power of the court. Tyrion felt his body freeze as he saw the eyes of all of House Targaryen resting on him. Riella, in particular, watched her dear friend's son with a sad sigh. He had her hair, albeit a shade lighter, but his face was nothing like Joanna's. The memory of sweet Joanna made Riella sigh sadly, mourning the loss of her longtime friend. "Would you like to introduce yourself, Lord Tyrion?" Enar asked with a calm look. He knew there was something almost childish about some of his actions, especially the way he amused himself by watching people's reactions in embarrassing or terrifying situations. Perhaps it was his personal hobby, but compared to the hobbies of other kings before him, his seemed harmless. "Right?" Tyrion was surprised by the courtesy and hastened to reply, "I am Tyrion of House Lannister, your grace. It is an honor to be in your noble presence on this most memorable day." Call him what you will, but for Tyrion the priority was to stay alive. And if flattery could guarantee his survival, he was more than willing to pay compliments even to the hairy balls of the young king in front of him. "What shall I do with you, Tyrion of House Lannister?" Enar asked with an amused smile on his lips. "There are those who wish for your head at this very moment." The king's gaze turned to Oberyn Martell, who regarded the kneeling Tyrion with a coldness that Enar couldn't help but admire. Enar knew that he would look the same way if someone killed someone important to him. Tyrion noticed Oberyn's gaze and felt a bitter smile appear on his lips. His already slim chance of survival seemed to disappear in the presence of the Prince of Dorne. If there was one house that rivaled House Lannister in hatred as much as House Targaryen, it was House Martell. "I'm clever, your grace," Tyrion stated firmly. "I'm not big or skilled with a sword, but my mind is sharp. My advice can be valuable." But Enar's next words left him surprised and almost shocked. "I know you're clever, Tyrion. I could use you in my court. But there's a big problem facing both of us." "And what problem would that be, your grace?" Tyrion asked, a thread of hope in his voice. No matter how difficult it was, he could make it happen. "Will you help me kill your father?" Tyrion's expression vanished in the same instant. Kill his own father? Even if Tywin was the cruelest man in the world, he was still his father. The man who had given him a home, food and rivers of gold all his life. Yes, he deserved the title of worst father in the world, but was that enough for Tyrion to help the enemy of House Lannister kill him? "Your grace, why don't we send the dwarf's head to Tywin? He will surely appreciate the gift." "Perhaps we could smash his face against the wall first," Oberyn suggested, casting a cold, murderous glance at Tyrion. The Prince of Dorne could barely contain his fury at the son of the man responsible for the death of his sister and nephew. Tyrion felt a shiver run through his body. Oberyn's gaze resembled that of a serpent, and now he understood perfectly why he was called the Serpent of Dorne. "A tempting offer," Enar replied with a slight smile, "but it won't have much effect on Tywin. He would turn his son's death into an opportunity for profit and prestige. He might even claim that Tyrion died trying to kill Caraxes." If it were Stannis or Renly, Enar might consider the idea, as it would shake Robert mentally. But Tywin? He would use his son's death without scruple, especially the son he hated for taking the life of his beloved wife. Oberyn, though reluctant, moved away and sat down, but his eyes never left Tyrion, as if he was imagining various ways of killing him. Tyrion listened to the conversation between Enar and Oberyn with a bitter expression. He couldn't deny the Targaryen king's words. From what he knew of his father, the prediction was frighteningly accurate. "Your Grace, may I say something?" Barristan, who was still kneeling beside Tyrion, intervened, drawing Enar's attention. The king's curious gaze landed on the Knight of the Kingsguard, and he nodded slightly, indicating that he should speak. "Your Grace, Tyrion may be small, but he is twice as honorable as many men who call themselves knights. He's a good man, unlike his father, who is a truly ruthless monster." Barristan spoke firmly, while Tyrion stared at him in surprise. Although the knight had promised to intercede on his behalf, he had never imagined that the man would actually dare to do what he had said. Enar tapped his fingers rhythmically on the arm of the throne, lost in thought. After long minutes, he finally announced his decision. "Barristan, Tyrion Lannister will be imprisoned while I decide his fate." Tyrion's legs weakened, and he almost cried out with relief. He still had a chance to live. He didn't want to die, not yet. There was plenty of wine to taste, plenty of whores to enjoy, and places to explore. Barristan stood up and bowed respectfully. "Thank you for your kindness, Your Grace." "Kindness, murmured Enar, a slight smile on his lips. The word seemed ironic to him. In recent days he had had men, women, the elderly, and even children executed without hesitation. Being called kind seemed like a hypocritical compliment, but it still amused him. With the end of the gift ceremony, the banquet began. The guests took their seats, eating and drinking to their heart's content. "What are you going to do with Tyrion, husband?" asked Visenya, a touch of coldness in her gaze. Although Tyrion was not directly to blame, his father had ordered the deaths of Queen Elia and Prince Aegon. Enar didn't answer immediately. Instead, he returned the question, "What do you want to do, my queen?" Visenya was surprised, remaining silent for a few moments as she pondered her words. Daenerys, sitting next to her, watched her sister curiously. If it were her, she wouldn't kill Tyrion. What would be the difference between them and Tywin doing that? As Enar had said the other night, it was a never-ending cycle of hatred and death. Visenya wanted to kill Tyrion and at least partially avenge the death of her good sister and her nephew. "Would killing him satiate your hatred?" Enar asked again, looking at her with a smile. "You don't want to kill him?" Visenya concluded as she listened to his words, realizing that Enar had already made up his mind. "I want him to be my hand," Enar said casually, taking a sip of wine. His words left Visenya and Daenerys stunned. They could imagine many things, but never that Tyrion would become the hand of the king. After all, it was the second most important position in the Seven Kingdoms. But will he accept? "We're going to kill his father," Daenerys asked in disbelief. She couldn't imagine how Enar would persuade Tyrion to fight against his own blood. "I'll give him a reason to live and die for me." Enar smiled confidently. There was no doubt in his mind, Tyrion would not refuse what he had to offer. The dwarf would bend the knee and help him in the wars looming on the horizon. Daenerys pouted, frustrated that Enar wouldn't reveal what he would use to convince Tyrion, but put those thoughts aside. "Let's dance, nephew," Daenerys suggested, smiling mischievously. Enar smiled back, squinting at Visenya, who had a slightly envious expression at her sister's words. "I'll dance with you later, Vi." He kissed Visenya's cheek gently before standing up and holding out his hand to Daenerys. She took his hand with a smile and stood up with him. Visenya's mood improved with the kiss and her husband's words, although she still wanted to be the first to dance with him. Deep down, she blamed herself for not being quicker. Enar ignored the stares of everyone in the hall as she danced with Daenerys in the center. The 4 knights of the Kingsguard stood around, vigilant, protecting the king and queen with cold, watchful eyes. "The position of Hand of the King is very powerful," Daenerys commented, feeling his hand on her waist. She moved closer, enjoying the warmth of his body. "I know," replied Enar with a whisper in her ear as they spun together. "But the Hand of the King won't have that much power. In fact, all the positions will be divided into 2 or 3. I want to decentralize those powers." Of course he knew how powerful the title of Hand of the King was, but he didn't intend to leave so much power in the hands of a single person. This would apply to all the positions on the small council. In his vision of the future, his ministers should compete with each other while he watched, controlling both sides. What if they discovered his strategy? He didn't care. His ministers would be intelligent men and would understand that this was not a request but an order. They could profit, but never as much as the king. And if they didn't accept these rules, Enar would simply replace them with someone who did. Daenerys looked at her future husband and understood that this was only the beginning. He would bring about a complete revolution in Westeros' system of government. How could Daenerys have imagined that Enar would change the system of nobility and centralize power for the crown, taking large parts of land from the neighboring kingdoms and diminishing the local power of the nobles? These nobles would not have as much power or autonomy as before. Chapter 75, Conspiracies 3. A battle doesn't only take place on the battlefield, a seemingly casual conversation is often more brutal in a person's heart. Enar Targaryen, observing Hisdar zo Lorak. A day had passed since Enar's coronation, and now he was officially king, at least in the eyes of the people of Essos. In Westeros, however, Robert's allies considered him a fraud, perhaps even a usurper. Descending the stone stairs that led to the prisons, Enar smelled the putrid odor of the place. The stench of sweat and mold hung in the air, mixed with other smells that he preferred not to identify at the moment. Behind him, Leda accompanied him, wearing her shining armor and the white cloak of the royal guard. Although she was short, the girl exuded an aura of authority that would put many men to shame. At the end of the staircase, a long corridor revealed itself. Iron bars lined both sides, while scattered torches cast a pale orange light over the room. Enar observed the cells as he passed. Inside, old and decrepit priests, who had refused to accept the religious reforms he had implemented, were slowly rotting away. The conditions of these men were miserable, inhuman even, but the smile on the young king's lips never wavered. How should he feel about those who refused to keep up with the times? Dying in the darkness of those cells without suffering was the greatest mercy he could grant. After walking through a few more cells, Enar stopped in front of one in particular. Inside, Tywin Lannister's youngest son was reading a book. Unlike the other prisoners, Tyrion had a comfortable bed, clean water and decent food, only the stench was something he shared with the others. When he heard footsteps stopping in front of his cell, Tyrion didn't want to turn his attention away from the book at first. He was immersed in reading the Bible of the Red Faith. However, when he looked up and realized who was there, his expression changed instantly. He closed the book, got off the bed and bowed slightly as a sign of respect to the king. "Your Grace." Tyrion greeted Enar with a respectful tone, his voice carrying a mixture of admiration and fear. He avoided looking directly into the young monarch's eyes, but he still couldn't hide his curiosity. At last, Tyrion understood why all the people of Volantis and other parts of Essos worshipped Enar as a messiah, perhaps even as a god. The book he had just read was simply unlike anything else he had read in his life. The indoctrination capacity of the book, called the Bible, was incredible to say the least, and Tyrion had no doubt that the Red Faith would quickly spread throughout Westeros. Although the Faith of the Seven preached kindness, gentleness and chivalry, the methods of the Red Faith priests were incomparable in terms of indoctrination efficiency. The advance of that religion seemed inevitable. And that same book was written by the same man who stood before him. How could Tyrion not feel afraid of a man capable of making millions of people worship him as a god with a mere book? Leda opened the cell door and positioned herself next to the cell. Enar entered without any hesitation. He looked around, noticing how surprisingly organized everything was. When he noticed the Red Faith Bible resting on the bed, his lips curved into an amused smile. "Was the reading fun, Lord Tyrion?" Enar asked, curiosity evident on his face. Tyrion hesitated for a moment before answering truthfully, entertaining and quite revealing in some respects. He wasn't lying. Reading it had really made him reflect, especially on some life lessons that resonated deeply with him. This only increased the admiration he felt for Enar. Enar wasn't surprised by the answer. He knew that prisoners often turned to religion for solace or guidance, and it was precisely those who often showed the best behavior in prison. And although Tyrion hadn't been in prison for long, it was a short, life-changing experience, at least for those who really wanted to change their lives. "I'll be blunt, Tyrion." Enar stared into the dwarf's heterochromatic eyes, one green and the other black. "I want you to be my hand." The king's words left Tyrion completely stunned. If Visenya and Daenerys found the idea of naming him Hand of the King shocking, for Tyrion it was unthinkable. He was an enemy of House Targaryen, but here he was, being invited by the king himself to be Hand, one of the most prestigious positions in Westeros. Still, as he remembered Enar's goals and the legacy of House Targaryen, Tyrion sighed deeply, wearing a bitter, helpless expression. The chance to prove himself had become something he could never accept in his lifetime. Your grace honors me with this request, but I cannot betray my house, least of all my father. Tyrion refused with a determined tone. For the first time, Tyrion lifted his gaze and stared into the king's purple eyes, showing a determination he had rarely displayed in his life. However, as he did so, he was disconcerted. Those eyes weren't looking at him with contempt, disgust, or repulsion, emotions Tyrion had been used to since childhood. Enar's gaze was something different, human, full of genuine interest, as if he saw something in Tyrion that no one else saw. "What if I gave you a reason?" Enar asked, tilting his head slightly, his tone laden with curiosity. Tyrion was surprised by the question, but shook his head. He really couldn't imagine anything that could convince him to accept that position. "Look into my eyes," Enar ordered, activating his prescience. Although confused, Tyrion obeyed. The instant his eyes met the king's, he felt as if an invisible punch hit him in the stomach, taking his breath away and his balance for a moment. Suddenly, he was somewhere else. The landscape around him was peaceful, with green hills and a simple wooden house in the distance, enough to offer shelter from the rain and sun. The door of the house opened and a young woman came out. She must have been no more than 10 years old and somehow seemed strangely familiar to Tyrion. He tried to remember who she was, but the memory slipped away, hovering just out of reach. Time passed quickly in Tyrion's eyes. He saw the girl gradually mature, and the familiarity only grew when he saw the girl, much older than before, become the woman he had fallen hopelessly in love with when he was 12. Tisha. The name escaped Tyrion's trembling lips. He had seen it all. From the moment he met her, the sweet sound of her voice as she sang, to the impromptu wedding, blessed by a drunken septon in the presence of pigs. They were the happiest 15 days of his life, days he wished would last forever. But the dream turned into a nightmare. And then came the worst. The vision unfolded with brutality and cruelty. Tywin's guards, cold and merciless, abusing Tisha in a gang rape. Each cruel act accompanied by silver coins thrown at her feet as payment for her service. Finally, the ultimate humiliation. Tywin forced Tyrion to take part, to commit the same heinous act against the woman he loved. But as he was a Lannister, his coin was gold after all. A Lannister is worth more. Pain and hatred burned in his chest. But the scene changed. The anger dissipated momentarily, replaced by bewilderment, as he saw Tisha in a boat, heading for Pentos. There was no death scene as Jaime had told him. This only made him realize that not only had his father deceived him, but so had his brother. Then another scene appeared in his vision. Tyrion saw again, his eyes red with rage, the scene he could never erase from his memory. His father, Tywin Lannister, ordering Jaime to lie, saying that Tisha was just a prostitute. Time moved on quickly, and Tyrion found himself in front of a red faith church. A woman, now older, around 25, dressed in a red cloak, was handing out food to hungry children. Her hair was black, her eyes blue. Perhaps she wasn't extraordinarily beautiful in the eyes of the world, but for Tyrion there was no more beautiful woman. "Tisha," he murmured, his voice breaking, the desire to cry evident. But he stopped himself. He wouldn't cry, not in front of Enar. The vision disappeared, and Tyrion returned to the cold, damp cell. "So, do you agree to be my hand?" Enar asked, his voice gentle but firm. For all his authority, there was a spark of compassion in his tone. Tyrion raised his eyes to the king, his gaze filled with resentment and hatred. "I accept. I want Tywin Lannister dead." Not only would he kill the old man, but he would make Tywin see his greatest humiliation. Tyrion, the despised son, taking control of Casterly Rock, something Tywin would never allow. Enar smiled. "As of today, you are my hand." He held out his hand to help Tyrion up. "Now let's go. We have a meeting with a secret prince of a broken dynasty trying to rise again." Tyrion straightened his clothes, cleared his throat, and tried to compose his remaining dignity. Hisdar zo Lorak. Enar couldn't help but think of the man with the amber skin and dark red hair. It would be quite an interesting conversation. Chapter 76, Conspiracies 4. An exchange of lies and compliments. Leda Dane, Lady Commander of the King's Guard, thought as she observed the conversation between the king and the aspirant to be king. As Enar and Tyrion walked side by side, Tyrion watched closely as the people revered Enar with absolute devotion and respect. It was like a sacred ceremony. Everyone knelt down as they passed him and didn't even dare to look the king in the eye. Not even other kings could achieve that kind of respect with their most loyal subjects. The little lion of House Lannister wondered what Enar had done to inspire such adoration and sincerity in people. Little did Tyrion know that with his reforms Enar had abolished slavery, at least in Volantis. For someone who had once been a slave, this wasn't just a political change, it was nothing short of a miracle. And Enar's reforms didn't stop there. The Red Priests and Priestesses were instructed to teach children to read and write. This initiative was not limited to Volantis. In every city with a Red Temple, parents could send their children to receive a basic education. In these prototype schools, children learned to respect their father, mother, and religion, as well as discipline and loyalty to the king. At this time in Essos, the rulers of the 9 free cities were unaware that many cities gradually had Enar's influence in the shadows, ready to be used at the right moment. Enar knew that he would need trained officials in the future to administer the cities together with the nobility. After all, he couldn't allow the cities to be controlled exclusively by the nobles. What if a revolt broke out? Cities surrounded by walls could become war fortresses. And as we know, sieges of cities can last for months, even years. And if that happened, it could delay the armies for a long time, leading to a defeat in the war, something that Enar and any monarch would not want to happen. Tyrion hesitated for a moment, but after a brief pause he took a deep breath and asked in a serious tone. "Your Grace, I'd like to ask you something." Enar looked at him and smiled. "You don't need to ask permission to speak. You'll be paid to advise me. After all, I don't need an advisor who can't speak." For Enar, it didn't make sense to have an advisor who was afraid to express his opinions. It was the complete opposite of what an advisor should do. "What does your Grace plan for the future of House Lannister?" Tyrion asked without further hesitation. The question was subtle, as it involved many delicate areas, including the fate of the members of his house. "If you mean what I will do with the members of House Lannister, then only Tywin and Joffrey interest me," Enar replied in a calm tone. "As for the others, I don't care, but you and I know how dangerous your sister can be." Although eliminating all the Lannisters was a tempting idea, it wasn't what Enar wanted. Westeros was different from Essos. He needed to indoctrinate people before taking action that could be misinterpreted there. As for Myrcella and Tommen's loyalty, Enar planned to use blood magic to control them. It wouldn't harm them as long as they remained obedient, but any sign of rebellion would activate the magic, causing an agonizing death, with pain impossible to bear. Their deaths would look like heart attacks, preventing the blame from falling on him. Tyrion, knowing his sister well, knew that Cersei would fight tooth and nail for the lives of her children. Of that he had no doubt. Cersei could be called many things, but never a negligent mother. Still, Tyrion felt relief at Enar's words. The king was kinder than he had expected, allowing other members of House Lannister to survive despite what had happened. Tyrion, despite hating his own father to the point of wanting to devour him in revenge, didn't let anger cloud his judgment. He still valued the concept of family and didn't want it to be destroyed. Enar looked at Tyrion, who seemed immersed in thought, and asked with a deep look. "Tyrion, we're about to meet Hisdar. He appears to be a gentle man and is well-liked in the eyes of the city of Meereen, but in fact he is a secret prince of new guise and a descendant of great leaders of the past. What do you think a man like him is doing in Volantis while the 3 slave cities are preparing to attack me at this very moment?" He looked at Tyrion for an answer. "Isn't New Guise an island port city in the Gulf of Pain?" Tyrion asked, slightly confused. For him and for many, a small coastal town was not worthy of being considered a kingdom, let alone an empire like the legendary Old Guise. Still, Hisdar's presence in Volantis, just at this critical moment, was indeed suspicious, as Enar had said. What Hisdar was doing was not unlike offering himself up like a pig on a silver platter. A man who could stake his life on something was dangerous. "You underestimate the greed for power, my hand. Many have ambition, but those often lack the resources or influence to fulfill their ambitions." Enar replied with an amused smile. "Hisdar, however, is a man who possesses ambition, wealth, and power. He also relies on his slave armies in Meereen." Tyrion understood Enar's implicit message. Hisdar had come to Volantis to negotiate something. And if that was what he was imagining, Tyrion was eager to find out what price Hisdar was willing to pay. Enar, Tyrion and Leda stopped in front of an ornate door. Leda stepped forward and opened it, revealing a luxurious and comfortable room. Hisdar was sitting in a comfortable seat, holding a glass of Volantis wine. The man seemed extremely relaxed, almost as if his life wasn't at stake if the negotiations went wrong. "I see you're enjoying yourself, Lord Hisdar," greeted Enar with a smile as she sat down opposite him. Leda positioned herself behind the king, staring at the dark red-haired man with a cold gaze. As always, her hand rested on the hilt of her sword, ready to draw it at any moment. Tyrion, for his part, settled into a chair with some difficulty and cast a calm glance at Hisdar, accompanied by a charismatic smile. "The wine from Volantis is still excellent, just the right amount of sweetness, Your Grace," said Hisdar, placing the goblet on the table and returning the smile with equal kindness. "I'll be sure to arrange a few jars for you to take with you when you leave," Enar replied, looking at him with an intense gaze. "Your Grace has my thanks," Hisdar thanked him, leaning forward slightly in respect. Whether Hisdar would actually drink the wine offered by Enar was another matter. Poisoning, although considered undignified in Westeros, was common practice in Essos, especially in Slaver's Bay. As he watched the two exchange pleasantries as if they were old friends, Tyrion couldn't help thinking how hypocritical it was. But politics was, in essence, a game of hypocrisy exchanged in pursuit of greater profits, regardless of the method used. "I assume Lord Hisdar is aware of the attacks about to take place against my beautiful city," commented Enar, narrowing his eyes as he watched the man's reaction. Despite his gentle tone, Hisdar felt a chill run through his body. For a moment, he felt naked before those eyes, as if there were no secrets that could remain hidden. "It's a pity what's about to happen, but Your Grace should have expected it. After all, after the ban on slavery, many lost their sources of income. The great masters of Meereen and the other rulers of the two slave cities were completely furious at the news." Calming his turbulent feelings, Hisdar replied calmly, as if he himself had not encouraged the great masters of Meereen to attack Volantis. The good masters Astapor and the wise master of Yunkai merely followed Meereen in the attack. Enar almost laughed when he heard the man's false words. If he hadn't seen the past with his prescience, he might have believed his words to be legitimate. However, he knew that the facts were quite different from what Hisdar said. The good masters were indeed furious, but the news of the second field of fire had extinguished any anger they might have had. Fear of death was often an effective price to pay for clarity. "Yes, a pity. But what you're doing in my city right now is what intrigues me," Enar commented, fixing his eyes directly on Hisdar's. "I could kill you and send your head to the good masters of Meereen, as a warning of the fate in store for those who dare oppose me. Your Grace is a man of honor and heroism. How could I do such a thing?" Hisdar replied with a smile on his lips. "Am I?" Enar retorted in an amused tone, while his increasingly cold gaze pierced Hisdar like an invisible blade. Chapter 77, Conspiracies v. "Did I sign an agreement with the King of Hell?" Hisdar muttered to himself, watching the city of Meereen in flames. A revolt had broken out in the first month of his rule. Hisdar felt his heart almost explode with anxiety as he noticed the young king's cold eyes fixed on him, his eyes becoming more and more dangerous. His brain was screaming at him to stay put, flashing a gentle smile, while his heart was begging him to run away. Being in Enar's presence was like being in front of a lion, or rather a dragon, ready to devour him at any moment. "Of course I'm joking, Lord Hisdar." "How could I kill you?" said Enar, with a gentle smile on his lips. For a brief moment, he saw the fear on Hisdar's face and felt pleased to be causing his opponent so much stress. It was necessary to put that man in his place, otherwise he might start making unacceptable demands. "What a funny joke, Your Grace," replied Hisdar, keeping a smile on his face and hiding any trace of dissatisfaction he was feeling at the moment. He was well aware that, in his position, any sign of discontent could cost him his life in an instant. Hisdar understood that kings, rulers of free cities and lords were creatures with extremely inflated egos, driven by the ability to decide the fate of hundreds or millions. He knew this because he was now one of these figures, and even though at that moment he was hating every second of the conversation. Never in his life had he felt so humiliated as he did at that moment. Enar Targaryen was not offering him the respect that he, as the future king of the entire Slavers Bay, thought he deserved. It was eating away at him like a flame of rage and fury. Hisdar wanted to get up and leave, but he couldn't. Not while the sword of the woman behind Enar was ready to behead him at the king's slightest command. He knew the risks of this journey were great, but he hadn't expected Enar to be so irrational. However, he couldn't back down, not when the benefits of this conversation were so important. His future and all his ancestors' efforts were riding on this conversation, so how could he back down at this point? Enar, for his part, certainly knew what was going on in Hisdar's mind. But did that worry him? The answer was an absolute no. Why should he care? After all, it wasn't him who was asking for something, but Hisdar. From the start of the conversation, the man had placed himself in an inferior position, one that Enar had no intention of alleviating. Especially since Hisdar was the main orchestrator of the future attack on Volantis from the Slavers Bay. He had no intention of showing kindness to the cunning and intelligent man in front of him. "Your Grace, I would like to orchestrate a theater." Hisdar got straight to the point. He knew that the longer he remained in front of Enar, the more disadvantages he would accumulate. The young king always seemed to have the upper hand in any situation. Enar and Tyrion exchanged interested glances when they heard the proposal. The king, in particular, looked away for a brief moment, glimpsing fragments of the future. His lips curved into an amused smile as he realized some interesting possibilities. "I'm listening to your proposal," said Enar as he picked up a grape and chewed quietly, keeping his gaze fixed on Hisdar, awaiting his next words. Hisdar breathed a sigh of relief. His biggest fear was that Enar wouldn't be interested in the idea. However, as long as the king showed a modicum of curiosity, half the plan was already underway. "I want to be a hero to the people of Slavers Bay," declared Hisdar, his ambition clearly evident in his voice. His brown eyes seemed to shine brightly, as if he could already envision the glorious moment when his name would be proclaimed by heralds to ecstatic crowds. Although Enar had expected something along those lines, his lips curved into a mocking smile. "So you want me to back down during the attack, allowing you to gain the prestige of defeating the mighty mounted king who rode an enormous dragon? A theater to win the support of the upper classes of Slave Bay and crown yourself king." It was a bold proposal, but Enar couldn't help but find Hisdar's audacity amusing. It wasn't a completely bad plan, but it was far from foolproof either. He wondered how Hisdar would handle the situation if Enar didn't fulfill his promise. After all, such an obvious lie could be exposed at any moment. And when the upper classes of the three cities found out that the newly crowned king of Meereen was actually a liar, Hisdar wouldn't survive, no matter how much money or power he had. However, Hisdar's idea benefited only him. What would Enar gain apart from bearing the infamy of losing a battle? Noticing the doubts on the young king's face, Hisdar smiled confidently and declared, 10,000 unsullied, 5 million gold pieces and 50 warships. The price surprised Tyrion. Although he had expected something exorbitant, he hadn't imagined that Hisdar would be so bold and generous. Even so, the theatrical plan between Enar and Hisdar was far from perfect. What if Hisdar wasn't crowned king in the end? He would be gambling big at a colossal cost, only to guarantee nothing in the end. "It's a good price for me to put you on the throne of Meereen and the entire Slavers Bay," commented Enar, popping another grape into his mouth. He smiled casually before continuing, "But it's still not enough for me to lose my prestige of invincibility." The words spoken with such nonchalance made Hisdar clench his teeth, even though he tried to keep his composure in the face of his fate spoken casually. The truth was obvious, Enar wasn't as enthusiastic about the proposal as Hisdar himself. And for good reason. While Hisdar would gain prestige, Enar would lose his. What was more serious was the kind of message this would send out to the world. As strong as he was, Enar was not invincible. And that, honestly, was a very dangerous idea in Enar's eyes. What if all 8 free cities joined forces against Enar because of this weakness in the eyes of many? The only reason they were still hesitating was the terror caused by the second field of fire, where Enar had burned tens of thousands of people in just 15 minutes. Seeing that Enar didn't seem interested, Hisdar gritted his teeth and increased his offer. 10,000 unsullied, 10 million gold coins and 60 warships. Enar, however, remained indifferent. He knew that Hisdar could offer up to 100 million gold coins, and yet the proposal would not convince him. The real price of this theater was far greater than any wealth. The message of weakness that this would send out to the world would create long-term problems, problems that Enar was not prepared to face now, let alone in the future. It was wiser to destroy the free cities individually than to risk a powerful alliance between the 8 free cities, capable of mustering 500,000 soldiers, or even 1,000,000, depending on the circumstances. The gain offered by Hisdar was simply not worth the effort or the potential strategic disaster. Hisdar gritted his teeth even harder before making another desperate attempt. We can change the theater to a resistance fight instead of a retreat. Although the prestige of resisting against Enar was less than that of defeating him, it was the only alternative Hisdar could see. After all, he had no way of forcing Enar to accept the proposal. Enar, on the other hand, liked this idea better. He could turn this resistance into an opportunity to train the developing Sardaukar, placing them side by side with the novice troops under the supervision of war veterans. But would Enar be satisfied with just that? Certainly not. Popping another grape into his mouth, he made his own counter-proposal, smiling gently. I want Meereen to pay monthly tributes and temples of the Red Faith to be built in the 3 cities, Meereen, Yunkai, and Astapor. Hisdar's face paled when he heard Enar's demands. Theft. There was no other word to describe what the young king was proposing. Enar was, in fact, legally stealing from Hisdar. But on reflection, Hisdar saw an opportunity. With the presence of the Red Faith, he could incite a conflict between the religious fanatics and the Sons of the Harpy, weakening both sides and consolidating his control over Meereen. The idea began to seem less absurd in his mind. Enar, while eating another grape, noticed the hesitation in Hisdar's countenance and couldn't help but smile. Hisdar seemed to have overlooked something crucial, the current strength of the Red Faith. Of course, he couldn't be blamed for that. Who, after all, would have thought that this religion would transform so profoundly in less than 6 years? As he watched Hisdar's resistance slowly dissolve, Enar was already anticipating what would come next. He would happily watch Hisdar's reign being consumed by flames, flames that he himself would light. Chapter 78, Conspiracies 6. Seeing the future usually gives you a feeling of invincibility, but when you see millions of timelines showing different realities, you realize how changeable the future can be. Enar I Targaryen, God Emperor of Planetos. What do you think? Enar asked, looking at Tyrion with a carefree smile. Tyrion reflected for a moment before answering with his calm tone and a hint of curiosity. Your Grace controlled the conversation the entire time. You showed no weakness at any time, which forced Lord Hisdar to accept an extremely unfavorable deal. The dwarf paused before expressing his doubts. What I don't understand is why your Grace agreed to take part in this theater. Even if money and soldiers are valuable resources, allowing Lord Hisdar to establish a kingdom in Slaver's Bay seems risky. It was understandable that Tyrion had these doubts. Unlike Enar, he didn't possess the gift of prescience to see into the future and plan ahead. First, there's the training of my troops, especially the elite troops, the Sardaukar. Secondly, unlike other cities, there are no Red Faith temples in Slaver's Bay. This represents a perfect opportunity for us to infiltrate and start indoctrinating followers, replied Enar, without revealing all the details, but sharing most of the plan with confidence. And why is your Grace so interested in indoctrinating followers, especially in Slaver's Bay? Tyrion asked, intrigued. He could understand the need to train troops, but wasting time on religion seemed an out-of-place move, especially when an imminent war was on the horizon. Tyrion, Enar began with a patient tone, the basis of a solid government is faith and determination. The more people who believe that I am an envoy of the gods, the more unshakable my government will be. An example of this is Volantis. The Triarchs, who ruled the city for centuries, were wiped off the map because they underestimated the power of faith and dared to anger the people by trying to kill their messiah. Enar smiled, amused, as he watched the shock grow in Tyrion's expression. Tyrion finally understood what Enar was trying to explain. Faith was not just a matter of belief, it was an instrument of power. An army could be defeated, but a fanatical people driven by faith were much harder to contain. Even so, he found it hard to believe. What could commoners do in the face of a properly armed and trained army? And then something Enar had mentioned earlier clicked in Tyrion's mind. There were no temples of the Red Faith in Slaver's Bay. Connecting the dots, Tyrion came to an alarming conclusion. He stared at Enar, completely shocked, as his brain processed the information. Temples were not just places of religious indoctrination. They were fortresses of war, filled with weapons and armor. How many temples does the Red Faith have on the entire continent of Essos? Tyrion asked, his voice laden with incredulity. Enar only smiled without answering directly, but the gleam in his eyes suggested that the answer was far more terrifying than Tyrion could have imagined. As Tyrion had said, the temples of the Red Faith did indeed function as weapons depots. Although it wasn't possible to supply all the temples with large quantities of weaponry, there was always a significant amount stored, especially in the larger cities, such as the 8 free cities. And what happens when your grace decides that the people are ready to rise up against their slave masters? Tyrion asked, curiosity evident in the tone of his voice. He knew that Enar was not only preparing Westeros, but also laying the foundations for conquering all of Essos. Of course, after giving them hope of freedom, I'll give them the tools to conquer that freedom. Enar replied as he ate the last grape from the tray, an amused smile curving his lips. Tyrion couldn't help feeling a little sorry for Hisdar. The man was risking everything to build a kingdom of his own, unaware that he was just one piece in a larger game, a conspiracy meticulously orchestrated by Enar. A plan that would guarantee the conquest of Slavers Bay without the need to mobilize a large army or provoke an unnecessary bloodbath. This level of cunning and calculation was truly terrifying in Tyrion's eyes. Tomorrow we will hold an early meeting with all my advisors and family members. Be present and properly dressed for the occasion. The hand of the king brooch will be delivered to your chambers in the morning. Enar rose from his chair and cast one last glance at Tyrion, who still seemed absorbed in his thoughts. We will do great things together, Tyrion of House Lannister, he said with a smile. Don't let me down. As Enar disappeared along with the members of his Kingsguard, Tyrion leaned back in his chair and muttered to himself. Father, you'd be proud, wouldn't you? Your son has finally become Hand of the King, the most powerful position after the throne. But even as he said it, Tyrion knew that Tywin would never be proud of him, no matter what he achieved. His hatred of his father ran deep, born of grief that he was the cause of his mother Joanna's death. Tyrion laughed softly, abandoning any desire to win Tywin's respect or love. He would now focus only on himself. He would be Lord of Casterly Rock. In the future, he would have a wife and probably a son or daughter, and to ensure a good future for his future family, he would serve Enar with devotion and intelligence. After all, there would always be others lurking to take his place. That same night, Enar was in his quarters, watching the moon through the open window, when he felt a faint chaotic energy trying to connect with his mind. For a moment he was cautious, but soon relaxed when he recognized the source of the energy. Brynden Rivers. Unlike before, Enar no longer needed to sleep to access his subconscious. After consuming the water of life, he had awakened to a level of consciousness that allowed him to fully explore his true capabilities. Capabilities that he himself was discovering over time. Great Uncle, greeted Enar, as his mind connected with the astral projection of the old blood crow. Brynden watched him, his eyes carrying something between awe and terror. To anyone else, Enar still looked human, but Brynden could see beyond appearance. To him, Enar was a monstrous mass of magical energy, pure, chaotic, and completely inhuman. The body the young king inhabited was nothing more than a receptacle for this immeasurable force. What have you done, Enar? Brynden asked incredulously, his voice filled with a mixture of admiration and discomfort. The oppression emanating from Enar's presence was overwhelming, even in his astral form. Enar, sensing his great-uncle's discomfort, made a simple gesture with his hand, shielding Brynden from the intensity of his mind. He knew better than anyone that the abyss that resided within him was something few could bear. Don't worry, just tell me what's going on. Enar ignored the question and gave Brynden a serious look. His great-uncle would never contact him if it wasn't urgent. Manifesting one's conscience on another continent was no trivial matter, even for someone like Brynden. Realizing that Enar didn't intend to answer his question, Brynden pushed the disturbing thoughts aside and concentrated fully on the moment. The Night King is moving faster than we anticipated. The dead are increasing at an alarming rate, far beyond anything we've seen before. In less than a month, at least 30,000 undead have been forced from their graves. His voice carried a grave tone, while his exhausted mind showed signs of collapsing at an astonishing speed. Normally, he would have been able to maintain the connection for dozens of minutes, but at this rate, it wouldn't have lasted more than one. Enar couldn't help a trace of dissatisfaction appearing on his face. He knew that the cold god was blessing the Night King with even more power, compromising his own plans and forcing him to adjust them hastily. Send Mance to the wall immediately. Aemon and Jeor Mormont will open the gates when the free people arrive. Mance must relinquish his kingly titles and hand over the Horn of Winter. Enar's words came in a firm tone without hesitation. Hesitation led to chaos, and chaos led to unnecessary deaths. He didn't want that, and Mance should be more anxious than he was. The man possessed a legendary artifact that could bring down the wall, and that was a risk that Enar wanted to get into his hands as soon as possible. I will see to it that all parties receive their orders, but have the northern lords accepted hundreds of thousands of savages into the northern lands? Food to supply such a population is no simple matter. Brynden couldn't help but advise his grandnephew with concern. Enar sighed and remembered that people needed food to survive. I'll fly to the High Garden in a few days. I'll order House Tyrell to send enough food to last a few months. I'll also have Kinvara send a batch of food to White Harbor. Enar spoke with a helpless tone. That was why he hated changing his plans. Brynden nodded and quickly disconnected his mind from Enar's. He had to be even faster than Enar. I'm going to rip this cold god's head off. Enar muttered to himself, his voice containing a shocking murderous intent. His entire subconscious changed drastically with his murderous thoughts, transforming into an apocalyptic scenario. Clouds of black and red smoke made up the whole scene, with lightning occasionally crossing the place. Chapter 79, The Death of Jon Arryn. Lies never stay hidden forever, and they usually come out at the most unwanted moment. Varys the Spider. The bells of the Great September of Baelor echoed with a deep, distant sound, alerting the entire city of King's Landing. Only 4 occasions justified the ringing of the September spells. The death of a king, the death of the High Septon, or the death of someone of great importance. In addition, only the royal wedding merited such a ceremony. However, as there was no news of a royal wedding, that left 3 options. Inside the Great September of Baelor, Robert Baratheon, first of his name, looked at the body of his adoptive father, cold and lifeless before him, with a surprisingly calm expression. The king of the 7 kingdoms had slimmed down enough for anyone to notice the difference, a sign of the silent changes that had been taking place. "Old Eagle, you dare to leave me at this moment," muttered Robert, his voice laden with sadness, despite his impassive countenance. Even so, the weight of grief was evident in the most powerful man in Westeros. How could he not be in mourning? Like Eddard Stark, Robert had grown up under the tutelage of Jon Arryn, Lord of the Vale. His feelings for his adoptive father were strong, and the loss of the figure who had shaped his youth affected him deeply. Jon Arryn had been more than the hand of the king. He had been a mentor, a moral compass in turbulent times. Upstairs, watching Robert beside Jon Arryn's body, Cersei wore an expression of grief. However, those who knew the queen knew that she reserved her true sorrow only for her children and, perhaps momentarily, for Jaime, her twin brother. Her green eyes, however, betrayed her facade. The almost visible joy in her gaze was testimony to her true feelings. "Are you sure no one will notice? Pycelle has been ordered to conduct the investigation into the death of the Hand of the King," Jaime murmured, his voice low as he avoided looking directly at Jon Arryn's body. Once again, the Kingslayer had tarnished the name of the Kingsguard, a burden that over time he had come to carry with indifference. Even so, he regretted giving in to his sister's requests. Jon Arryn was an important ally of the crown, and his death would weaken the throne and throw the Vale into an uncertain situation. Lisa Arryn, according to the rumors at court, was not in her best mental state. But there was no turning back. Jon Arryn was dead. He won't tell. "Pycelle is our father's dog," Cersei replied coolly, while a perverse pleasure spread across her face as she gazed at Jon Arryn's lifeless body. She savored that feeling of power, an ecstasy that made her feel unshakable. For Cersei, Jon Arryn's death was inevitable. He had investigated her life for over a year, until he finally discovered the true paternity of her children. A man with such knowledge could never stay alive for so long. What's more, thanks to Jon's investigations, Cersei managed to track down all of Robert's bastards. One by one, she planned to eliminate them, until there was no threat left to Joffrey's throne. Jaime sighed, observing the expression on his sister's face. Cersei wasn't exactly a master at disguising her emotions, which often caused friction between her and Robert. As for Joffrey, Jaime didn't consider him worthy of sacrifice. In the eyes of the Kingslayer, Joffrey was nothing more than a jet of semen in Cersei's pussy. Everything Jaime had done had been for Tommen and Myrcella. Only for them. "Any news of our brother, Tyrion?" asked Jaime, his tone heavy with concern. His younger brother's disappearance made him deeply uncomfortable. "He's your brother. To me, he's a monster." Upon hearing Tyrion's name, Cersei frowned in disgust and responded harshly. The mere thought of calling that creature her brother made her nauseous. She still couldn't understand how her father had allowed that freak to carry the Lannister name for so long. Jaime felt anger rise in his chest at hearing his sister's words, but he restrained himself. He remained silent, still consumed with worry about Tyrion's fate in Braavos. However, how could Cersei and Jaime have imagined that the day after Jon Arryn had died, rumors began to circulate the alleys of King's Landing, a rumor that soon became talk for the city's families to discuss obscured by the walls of each house. The king had no children, and his children with the queen were actually the fruit of incest between the queen and the Kingslayer. The queen allegedly killed the Hand because he had discovered the truth about the incest. No one knew who had told the rumor, but it soon became common knowledge among the population, which simply could not be covered up or even blocked. Crack! Another poor vase from Myr was smashed against the wall. There was only an expression of fury reflected on Cersei's face at that moment. She had no doubt that the source of the rumors was Jon Arryn. Perhaps the man had discovered that he was in danger and had planned something like this in case something happened to him. Cersei didn't care why, she wanted to tear the old man's corpse to pieces right now and then throw it to the pigs to eat. Arr! Tearing at the sheets in rage, Cersei let out an angry, hysterical scream. Even if the rumors weren't believed, her son's throne would still be unstable for anyone who wanted it. Add that to the Targaryen across the sea with a dragon, and Cersei could already imagine her son being killed, and that made her extremely furious and full of fear that something would happen to the beautiful Joffrey. Biting her nails nervously, Cersei knew she couldn't wait and had to finish off all of Robert's bastards as soon as possible. Especially those who looked like Robert, who had to die as soon as possible so that no one could follow Jon Arryn's trail. Taking a deep breath to calm herself, Cersei tidied up her messy hair and flashed a beautiful, elegant smile, transforming herself back into the elegant queen that everyone had the impression of. On the other side of the Red Keep in the training field, Robert was sweating profusely as he swung his warhammer with truly skillful movements full of shocking brutality. Not far from him, Varys, wearing a purple tunic, watched the king with a gentle smile. The man's bald head glistened against the sun as a faint scent of petals wafted around him. "Who spread the rumors, eunuch?" Sinking his hammer into the chest of a mannequin wearing armor, Robert wiped the sweat on his face with his arm and asked in an angry voice. He was furious when he found out about the rumors. No man could remain indifferent after hearing about his wife's infidelity, let alone a king like Robert. He wanted to cut out the tongues of the people who were saying his 2 sons and 1 daughter were not of his seed. Although his sons and daughter did look like Cersei and Jaime, Robert firmly believed that all 3 came from his sack and no other man's. He didn't care so much about Joffrey, he even wished the monster had died while he was growing up. The thought of handing over the throne to a monster like his son kept Robert from wanting to abandon everything and go to the free cities to enjoy the life he had always wanted. "The rumors started in Flea Bottom, Your Grace. Some of my little birds were killed, perhaps for seeing something they shouldn't have," Varys reported in a slightly lower tone, afraid of angering the king in front of him. He had personally seen what happened to the training dummy. Robert showed a serious expression. Apparently the rumors were orchestrated almost the moment Jon Arryn died, and it made him think that someone had killed his adoptive father and spread rumors to cover something up. Letting out a sigh, Robert really hated King's Landing. However, for the safety of his children he couldn't relax, especially with a Targaryen coming at him with an army of fanatics. Chapter 80, The Death of Jon Arryn 2. Chaos is an opportunity for the bold and a terrible fate for ordinary people. Littlefinger, Master of the Coin. In the small council chamber, Robert Baratheon was drinking noticeably less wine than usual. His blue eyes swept the room, hovering over each person present with the authority of a true king. "Ned will be the next hand. Send a raven ordering him to come to King's Landing. Also send a marriage proposal. My sons and daughters will marry his," announced Robert, with an indifferent tone. Cersei gritted her teeth, irritated by the disdain in her husband's voice, as if he were dealing with goods and not people. The thought of her daughter having to spread her legs for a barbarian from the north almost made her scream with rage. When Robert finished speaking, all eyes turned to Tywin Lannister. Some had amused expressions, curious to see the Lord of Casterly Rock's reaction. Many had expected Tywin to assume the position of hand after Jon Arryn's death, but it seemed that Robert had no intention of giving his father-in-law that honor. Joffrey will marry Lady Sansa Stark. Tommen will marry Lady Arya Stark. Myrcella, in turn, will marry Robb Stark, the heir to Winterfell, Robert declared, his voice firm and without hesitation, as if it were the only sensible choice. However, there was something that bothered the king deeply. He had only 3 legitimate sons to negotiate alliances with, while Ned Stark had 4 sons, 2 daughters and even a bastard who bore the name Jon Snow. Robert wished for more heirs to marry off all his friends' offspring, but that was out of his reach. Cersei, about to protest for the freedom of at least her daughter, felt her body freeze when Tywin's cold, calculating eyes fell upon her. All courage, anger, and indignation evaporated before that implacable gaze. Tywin, realizing that his daughter would remain silent, turned to Robert and with characteristic calm said, "Your Grace, House Tyrell continues to refuse to heed your call. They have reinforced the borders, especially in the west, and their vassals are mobilizing throughout the Reach. It is wiser to marry Prince Joffrey to Lady Margaery Tyrell." Tywin's words generated murmurs of concern among those present. Everyone there knew that the alliance with the Tyrells was crucial. Without it, the crown would face serious difficulties in sustaining a prolonged war. From House Tyrell's recent movements, it was clear that they had no intention of supporting the crown against the Targaryen king on the other side of the narrow sea. Robert didn't reply immediately. He remained silent, awaiting the opinions of his advisors. "Your Grace, allow me to attack the Arbor. I will destroy House Redwine's fleet and bring House Tyrell to the crown." Stannis spoke firmly, his voice rigid and his posture imposing. For him, House Tyrell's hesitation was enough to consider them traitors. Stannis' words were bold, even arrogant, but no one in the room could ignore the military brilliance of the Lord of Storm's End. Although reluctant, many in the room had a certain confidence in his ability to deliver what he promised. However, Tywin Lannister was the first to object. "That's a stupid decision," he said, raising his voice slightly. His cold eyes fixed on Stannis with visible dissatisfaction. Attacking House Tyrell now would make them completely in league with Prince Targaryen. "We'd be handing over one of the most powerful houses in Westeros." Tywin continued, deliberately ignoring Stannis' increasingly angry look. He continued with the calm and calculating tone of a man who always saw several steps ahead. "Taking risks right now is like throwing the continent into a civil war. When war breaks out, we'll need all our forces concentrated to defeat our enemies. Instead of wasting resources, strengthen the city's defenses with scorpions, reinforce the troops, fortify the castles and ships. There's a lot of work to be done before we consider any risky action." Despite his obvious irritation with Tywin, Stannis recognized that the old strategist had a point. Losing the royal fleet in a poorly planned attack would be catastrophic, and the risk was too great at this delicate moment. Tywin, for his part, knew that destroying House Tyrell would be advantageous in the long run, but it wasn't something that could be done now. It would be a waste of time, soldiers and resources. For the moment, even though they were a dangerous element, the Tyrells remained asleep. Robert, who had listened to the discussions in silence, made the decision without hesitation. "We'll do as Tywin suggested. I'll marry Joffrey to Margaery Tyrell. Littlefinger, you will go to Highgarden to negotiate terms with Mace Tyrell." The king's voice echoed through the room with a loud, clear tone. He was perhaps not the most skilled strategist, nor the most cunning general, but as a warrior he knew the value of quick decisions. Hesitation led to death on the battlefield, and right now he couldn't afford to hesitate. Littlefinger smiled, his calm, enigmatic gaze hiding the storm of intent that was raging inside him. "As you wish, Your Grace," he replied with a discreet but purposeful bow. For him, this mission was more than just an order from the king. It was a golden opportunity to plunge Westeros even deeper into chaos. Jon Arryn was dead, and the plan to take control of the Vale was already underway. All he needed was to fan the flames of war, allowing the chaos to spread like wildfire. Littlefinger knew that chaos was the ladder, and he would climb it until he reached the greatest power of all, the Iron Throne. Robert turned, his cold, calculating eyes landing on Varys, who had remained silent until then. "What happened to the dragon's spawn?" asked the king, his voice laden with icy menace. Varys bowed elegantly before answering in his usual gentle tone. He was crowned by the Reverend Mother in front of 700,000 people who knelt before him. Varys' words fell across the room like a stone thrown into a still lake, spreading waves of tension. The silence that followed was almost deafening in the room, weighed down by the significance of that statement. 700,000 people. The image of a crowd of that magnitude kneeling before Enar was overwhelming. If before he was just a young man with a dragon, now in everyone's eyes he had become a true monarch. It wasn't just the fear of his dragon's power that worried them. It was the respect and reverence he inspired in his people. 700,000 people weren't kneeling out of fear, they were kneeling out of devotion. At that moment, the collective perception changed. Enar was no longer an aspirant to the throne. He was a legitimate king, someone who had come to take what he thought was rightfully his. And this idea hit them hard, because the same law that gave Enar the right to claim the throne was the one that sustained Robert's reign and would guarantee the legitimacy of his descendants. But Robert showed no change in expression when he heard Varys' words. Rhaegar also had the support of the people, but it was he who was sitting on the Iron Throne, not Rhaegar. What about the faceless assassins? Robert asked, with the same cutting coldness he was accustomed to whenever a Targaryen was involved. Varys lowered his gaze, sighing ruefully. Unfortunately, according to the House of Black and White, the assassination failed. Varys' tone was full of discontent. He hated everything that involved magic, and his aversion was even greater when it came to figures associated with fanatical religious sects. Robert couldn't help but snort coldly. The money that was supposed to be sent to Bravos doesn't need to go any further. Since House Black and White didn't complete the mission, we don't need to pay it. No one objected. It was fair not to be paid for a job that hadn't been completed. Only a fool would pay for a job that had failed. As Tywin said, we'll use this money to strengthen ourselves. Buy food from Essos, even if it's twice as expensive. We can't run out of food when the war starts. Robert spoke with a calm tone. This was also one of the measures to deal with in case House Tyrell really didn't support the crown when war came. Yes, Your Grace. Littlefinger, responsible for the finances of the Seven Kingdoms, replied with a confident tone. Chapter 81, The Death of Jon Arryn 3. I am benevolent, I always kill in the most painless way. Enar Targaryen to Olenna Tyrell. With incredible agility and speed, a flock of small, thrasher-like birds, gray with black feathers, flew in perfect harmony across the vastness of the blue sky. Free and peaceful, the group seemed immune to worry, almost as if they were the sovereigns of the skies. If it were an ordinary world, perhaps they would be. But this was no ordinary world. As they passed close to an enormous white cloud, which looked more like heavenly cotton candy, a gigantic mouth emerged from the depths of the cloud, cruelly devouring a large number of the birds. In an instant the rest panicked, scattering in all directions, trying to escape the invisible terror. The next moment, the source of that mouth was revealed. A colossal winged creature emerged from the cloud, tearing the sky apart with its imposing presence. Crimson scales covered its muscular, slender body. It was a being the size of a hill, whose existence defied all the laws of physics. But in a world where magic reigned, even universal rules could be subverted. Enar, mounted on Caraxes, looked out over the rapidly approaching continent. A satisfied smile crossed his face. Although Essos had become the center of his power, deep down Westeros would always be his true home. Looking at the tense figure sitting in front of him in the saddle, Enar couldn't help but be amused. Leda, with her usual cool and calm expression, exuded a subtle nervousness. Despite her rigid posture, the slight trembling of her body betrayed her. The girl was trying very hard not to show how much the situation was bothering her. You seem to be enjoying it, Leda, teased Enar with a mischievous smile, leaning over to whisper in her ear. Don't worry, whenever I fly I'll take you with me. Leda finally broke her mask of indifference. Her eyes glanced behind her, where she saw the teasing smile on the face of her king and cousin. She knew he was teasing her, yet the idea of flying often didn't appeal to her in the slightest. How humans could feel comfortable riding such a gigantic creature was something she couldn't understand. However, as Lady Commander of the Kingsguard, the king's requests were absolute. If your grace wishes, it shall be done. Leda replied with the cold, controlled tone that was her trademark. Enar rolled his eyes, frustrated by the predictable answer. He should have brought Daenerys with him, he thought to himself. At least she knew how to have fun. Leda, on the other hand, was incredibly similar to her father. They were both too serious, almost incapable of appreciating the smallest provocations or the most relaxed moments. Then, on the horizon, an iconic sight came into view. A vast city and a red fortress rising above it would catch anyone's eye. King's Landing, capital of the Seven Kingdoms. His choice of route to the Reach was strategic. Enar could have gone through Storm's End or Dorne, but passing through the Crownlands was the most direct route and, more importantly, the one that would provide him with the perfect opportunity to show off his power. Being seen in King's Landing, mounted on Caraxes, would mark the arrival of the new king in an unforgettable way. "Let's put on a show for the people of this city, Caraxes," murmured Enar to the dragon, who responded with a deep trill, as if he shared the king's excitement. Enar couldn't help but smile when he thought of the advantage of possessing an ability like prescience. Being able to glimpse into the past and later witness Robert and Tywin's expressions of dread and despair when they saw Caraxes for the first time was something he knew he would love. The show was about to begin. Robert was relaxing with his family, a habit he had developed since learning of the existence of Prince Targaryen and his dragon. The thought of facing such a threat brought with it the realization that his chances of survival in the future were uncertain, perhaps even minimal. That's why he began to value these simple moments with his children. Of course, with the exception of Joffrey. Watching Myrcella and Tommen play knight and princess, Robert's lips curved into a genuine smile. He had never thought he could find so much satisfaction in something so mundane. These little moments of tranquility were a way of escaping the cruel reality that hung over him. But the image of Prince Targaryen riding his dragon soon brought him back to the harsh truth. A storm was approaching and he needed to be prepared. Many thought that the marriage to House Stark was supposed to be just a political move to consolidate an alliance, but in fact it was something more calculated and darker. It was Robert's way of trying to ensure that his children would survive if he died and the Baratheon dynasty was destroyed. Robert was betting that the Targaryen prince, as much as he might hate him, would hesitate to take Myrcella and Tommen's lives if they were linked to his maternal family, House Stark. An attempt to appeal to ties of blood and honor, however tenuous. Yes, Robert knew it was monumentally hypocritical of him to think so. After all, he had laughed and celebrated in front of the dead bodies of Elia Martell, Rhaenys and Aegon, Rhaegar's wife and children. But even aware of his hypocrisy, he clung to this faint hope. He wanted above all to believe that Myrcella and Tommen could have a future, even if it was a future marked by the defeat of the Baratheons. "Father, I made this crown for you." Myrcella's sweet voice interrupted Robert's thoughts, and he couldn't help but smile. He looked at the small wreath his daughter was holding and, with an indulgent gesture, bowed his head. Myrcella, excited, smiled innocently and placed the wreath on her father's hair. "The great King Robert Baratheon!" she exclaimed with a tone full of pride, as if she were declaring it to the whole world. Robert blinked in surprise. Him a great king? He certainly knew what they called him behind his back: usurper, fat king, dirty king, silly king. Humiliating titles, but they had never called him great king. Not even on his best days. Still, hearing those words come out of his daughter's innocent mouth warmed something in his heart. For the first time in a long time he felt a shred of genuine happiness. He let out a deep laugh and stroked Myrcella's golden hair. Her radiant smile as she received his caresses made the moment seem perfect, but Robert couldn't help noticing something. The girl bore no resemblance to him. Nothing. Not the features, not the eyes, not the smile. This had been bothering him for years, and the seed of doubt grew in his mind again. Was it paranoia? Or worse, a truth he was afraid to face? Before he could delve deeper into these thoughts, something interrupted the calm. The sky abruptly darkened. A deafening, reverberating sound echoed throughout King's Landing. Robert looked up at the sky, and what he saw made his face turn pale. A dragon. His instinct took over. Without hesitation, he grabbed Myrcella and Tommen in his arms and ran towards the Red Keep. Even if they faced the same fate as Harrenhal, he knew that the thick walls of the fortress would offer some level of protection against the deadly flames of the creature flying over the city. "Dragon!" Myrcella shouted excitedly, her eyes shining with fascination as she looked up at the sky. To her, it looked like something out of a story. Yes, a dragon. Above King's Landing, a gigantic crimson-scaled dragon hovered, the shadow of its wings covering much of the city. Citizens stood still, staring at the creature with expressions that ranged from terror to fascination. A deadly silence gripped the city for a moment. until the dragon opened its mouth. "Dracarys," Enar commanded in a firm voice. Crimson flames exploded from the dragon's mouth, crossing the sky and covering a third of the sky. Despite the terror in people's hearts, many realized that the flames were not meant for them. Instead, the sky itself seemed to be the target. The spectacle that followed was breathtaking. The dragon broke through the cloud of fire it had created, emerging in a magnificent and terrifying flight. It was more than a show of strength, it was a clear message to everyone in King's Landing. House Targaryen had returned to Westeros once again. Chapter 82, House of Tyrell I. The first impression is always more important. People started remembering you from that moment on. Enar Targaryen, God Emperor of Planetos. The crimson dragon flew over King's Landing, releasing scarlet flames that lit up the sky and painted the clouds a fiery red. The spectacle was as frightening as it was majestic. Caraxes flew with surprising grace, despite his enormous size, passing through the curtains of fire that he himself created, as if dancing in the air. Down below, the whole city stopped to watch. The children, in particular, stared at the huge winged being with admiration and fascination, while the adults fought the instinct to flee. However, as the minutes passed, it became clear to everyone that the dragon and its rider had no intention of causing destruction. And everyone knew exactly who they were. The rumors that had been swirling around Westeros for months now hung alive and real in the sky. Enar Targaryen and his legendary crimson dragon, Caraxes. "It's a demonstration," Tywin Lannister broke the silence inside the small council chamber, the Lord of the Rock's voice cold and deep. He watched the dragon with an almost inhuman calm, while the others struggled to hide their discomfort. "A display of strength and power," he continued, without taking his eyes off the spectacle. "Prince Targaryen is announcing his arrival to everyone in Westeros. No subterfuge, no cunning schemes. He wants us to know that he will face anyone head-on." Robert Baratheon beside him crossed his arms. The king's gaze was fixed on the dragon dancing among the flames, reflecting a mixture of worry and weariness. He no longer feared for his children's safety at that moment, but the sight of a Targaryen displaying such control and power made his heart heavy. "At least he's not like his grandfather," murmured Renly Baratheon, almost in a whisper. But his words, full of fear, echoed in the silence of the room. All eyes fell on him, many of them full of disapproval. Although it was natural to fear a dragon, the men there knew better than to show weakness. If the situation escalated into a confrontation, they would need a cool head and a quick reaction, and Renly seemed incapable of that. Robert gave his brother a disgruntled look, but decided not to reprimand him. He turned his eyes to the sky, following the dragon's flight. Caraxes released another wave of flames, lighting up the horizon like an anticipated sunset. Then, under the gaze of the whole of King's Landing, the dragon let out one last roar. Its deep, deafening cry reverberated like a warning. And then, with a powerful flick of his wings, Caraxes turned and flew off towards a new destination. Inside the small council room, the expressions of those present changed dramatically as they realized the dragon's route. They knew exactly where Enar Targaryen was heading. The Reach. Robert's face was grim. Don't say marriage. He'd be happy if the Reach didn't agree to join this war, but seeing the size of the dragon, he knew the chances of that happening were extremely slim. A fool could see who had the upper hand in the ensuing civil war. "From this moment on, we must buy all the food we can in Essos as quickly as possible. We won't have enough food to sustain our armies," Robert ordered in a calm, majestic tone. Since Enar was declaring war, he would not cower and would fight head-on. Tywin looked at Robert with an appreciative gaze. He finally saw the man of 12 years ago, a powerful and voracious warrior, the demon of the trident. They needed a king like that right now, not a drunken king. If Robert had remained the same man before the rebellion, they would have had a better chance of winning the war, because the people loved their king, making the Targaryen prince's invasion extremely difficult. But that was impossible at the moment. After more than a decade of rule, the people never really liked their king. They wouldn't be sorry even if Robert died the next day. "I thought your grace was going to come down and greet your cousin," Lita commented, with a hint of surprise in her voice. The white cloak over her shoulders was scorched at the edges, a silent testimony to the spectacle of fire that Caraxes had offered over the capital. "Our first meeting will be on the battlefield, a more appropriate place for two monarchs to meet." Enar took a deep breath, trying to calm the turmoil inside him. Only he knew how much he had resisted the temptation to land in King's Landing, to look Robert Baratheon in the eye and confront him right there. But Enar stopped himself. He didn't want to meet Robert in King's Landing. The battlefield would be an appropriate place for him to kill his father's murderer. Leda watched her king carefully. She knew a bloodlust when she saw one. And at that moment, Enar exuded a murderous desire so intense that it was almost visible, something she thought was impossible, but she could vaguely see the air around him moving in an abnormal way. She admired him for it. If it had been her, she would have given in. She wouldn't have bothered with formalities or waited for the ideal moment. Justice would be done immediately, without hesitation. "We'll get to Reach in no time," Enar commented, changing the subject to get his mind off his dark thoughts. An amused smile formed on his lips. "I'm looking forward to seeing the Queen of Thorns' expression." Leda rolled her eyes, annoyed. Her king was good at many things, but his sense of humor was absolutely terrible. Who would care about someone's expressions in a situation like this? As Leda could tell with his gift, Enar rarely had surprises, and in order to prevent himself from becoming an emotionless machine, who only thought about ruling perfectly in order to bring humanity to eternity, he liked to experience his own feelings with surprising intensity. About an hour later, Enar and Leda saw a huge river meandering through the green pastures. Mander, the largest river in the Seven Kingdoms and also the source of all the Reach's prosperity. The huge river nourished the soil, making it extremely fertile and perfect for large-scale plantations. It was no wonder that the Reach was the second richest kingdom, second only to the mineral-rich western lands. Because of this wealth in food and money, the Reach had the largest army of the Seven Kingdoms, around 70 to 100,000 men, a truly giant army in medieval terms. "It's beautiful," Leda commented, looking at the river of water meandering through the green plains. She, who had never left Dorne, had only been to Volantis and nothing else, so Westeros was completely new to her eyes. Enar didn't look at Mander. His eyes were focused on the huge castle built on a particularly high hill. High Garden, the house of Tyrell's residence. Enar smiled and forced Caraxes to lower his altitude, making the castle seem closer and closer. On the plains below, Willis Tyrell, wearing green and gold armor, was riding a horse expertly, despite being crippled in one leg. Knights of House Tyrell were protecting their lord, riding around him. The face of the heir of High Garden was calm. It had been a few days since he had ridden on the Reach. It wasn't just for entertainment that he was doing this, but to see the surrounding terrain. He wanted to see if he might have other options should a war break out in the future. Burning crops was indeed a great threat, but in the face of Tywin Lannister, the most ruthless man in Westeros, he felt that threatening a powerful man like Tywin with something so trivial in the face of the outcome of war was a bit risky. "Milord Dash," just as one of Willis' knights was about to speak, the loud, powerful sound rang out above them and a darkness covered everyone. Confused, as there had been no sign of rain moments ago, Willis looked up and paled at the sight of the gigantic crimson shadow passing above him, causing strong winds to blow anything below. All the horses were intimidated by the aura of the biggest predator in the planet's food chain. "Go back to the High Garden." Willis grabbed his horse's reins and shouted to his riders. He wasted no time and rode at full speed towards the upper garden. An anxious expression appeared on the heir of the Reach. He was praying to the Seven that Prince Targaryen would be someone understanding. Chapter 83, House of Tyrell 2. This is a woman who stole her sister's husband on their wedding day and slept with him the same day. The poor man couldn't get up the next day? Enar Targaryen commented, watching Olenna Tyrell. The loud, powerful and savage roar shook the white walls of High Garden. The sound of deafening wing beats echoed throughout the castle before everyone heard a loud, heavy thud on the ground. Caraxes had landed in High Garden. The poor dragon had been flying for almost half a day. With the spectacle he had put on in King's Landing, he was really exhausted at that point. Enar loosened the belt that held him together with Leda and finally felt able to move as he pleased. Instead of climbing down the iron mesh below the saddle, he slid down the membrane of the dragon's wing, falling gently to the ground as he removed both gloves from his hands. Leda followed her king down after him. The girl had an expression of relief as she finally felt the ground beneath her feet. If it were possible, she would never want to fly again. However, knowing her king's slightly sadistic personality, she knew that her wish was impossible. Without knowing what Leda was thinking, Enar walked up next to Carax's neck and skillfully stroked the dragon's long scales. "Thank you, brother," he said in a grateful tone as he felt the warm touch of Carax's scales. Caraxes let out a trill similar to the sound of a cat and seemed to enjoy the caresses. The tremor in his scales clearly showed the pleasure he was feeling. Lita was speechless as she watched that huge dragon melt under Enar's caresses. The scene was so absurd that she couldn't say anything, just letting out a sigh. However, her eyes focused on the man behind a branch of meticulously trimmed bushes. It was a gardener who was completely frightened. Olenna, along with Mace, Lord of Highgarden, Lady Allery Hightower, Garland, Loras and Marjorie, surrounded by hundreds of knights, approached and observed the scene of a man stroking a huge dragon as if it were a cat. Seeing the golden white hair, Olenna didn't need to be a genius to deduce the man's identity, or rather the boy's, noticing some still childish features on his face. Looking at her son, who was paralyzed and had no intention of greeting the future sovereign, Olenna discreetly stepped on his foot and gave him a cold stare. The pain in his foot and the look on his mother's face roused Mace from his shock. Suppressing the fear in his heart, the Lord of Highgarden took a step forward. But the moment he did, the next scene made his blood run cold. The huge dragon suddenly raised its head and moved it forward, showing off its large, extremely sharp teeth. "Relax, Caraxes. It's not food, at least not at the moment." Enar laughed as he noticed the frightened expression on the Highgarden Lord's face and spoke in a gentle tone to Caraxes, who merely blew smoke out of his nostrils before resting his head back on the grass. Watching the scene, Olenna sighed wearily. With her hands on her stomach, she bowed slightly and spoke in a calm tone. "Welcome to Highgarden, Prince Enar." As soon as she spoke, Mace awoke from his fear and bowed, followed by his wife, sons and daughters. "Welcome to Highgarden, Prince." "Sorry for the abrupt arrival, Lord Mace and Lady Allery." Enar spoke first to the lords of Highgarden. Mace seemed flattered to be greeted before his mother, which brought a smile to his lips and dispelled his fear of the dragon. Allery just nodded, watching the Targaryen prince curiously. It wasn't every day that you saw a real dragon lord. Enar then turned his gaze to the old woman wearing green clothes that covered even her hair, leaving only her face showing. "The famous Queen of Thorns." He commented in an amused tone, noticing that, even in front of Caraxes, there was no fear in her eyes. "The famous dragon prince." Olenna pretended to be impressed and replied with a sarcastic tone, "I'm really surprised you look like your father." Enar laughed at her words without feeling offended by her tone. After constantly dealing with fanatics and sycophants, Olenna's attitude seemed like a breath of fresh air. Lita, however, cast a cold glance at the woman who dared to speak to her king like that. Perhaps noticing the young woman's deadly stare, Olenna looked at her curiously. But her curiosity was satisfied when she looked at the hilt of the sword. Dawn. With the armor and white cloak over her shoulders, Olenna quickly recognized the girl's identity and position. Nevertheless, she was surprised. There had never been a woman in the royal guard, even though a woman had created the order. This showed that the prince was more open-minded than many men in Westeros. After all, being protected by a woman wasn't exactly frowned upon. Even so, Olenna showed no weakness in the face of the cold gaze of such a young girl. She didn't fear the dragon, let alone a girl wielding a famous sword. "My lady commander of the royal guard and I are starving after half a day's journey." Ignoring the exchange of cold glances between the two women, Enar spoke with a smile on his face. "I will arrange it urgently, your grace." Seeing that Enar seemed easy to talk to, Mace relaxed and invited him in with an enthusiastic smile. The idea of marrying Marjorie was discarded the moment he saw the dragon. Just the thought that his grandchildren could possess such a great beast made Mace abandon any intention of marrying Marjorie to Prince Joffrey. Seeing her son's expression, Olenna wanted to hit Mace again, but held back in front of the Targaryen prince. However, she was determined to teach her son another lesson at another time. Enar smiled and followed the whole of House Tyrell as he felt everyone's gaze focused on him, whether out of curiosity or for some other reason. Noticing a particularly intense gaze on him, Enar looked discreetly to the side and saw Loras Tyrell watching him with a passionate expression. Enar was speechless, but decided to pretend he hadn't seen anything. He had nothing against it, but his sexual orientation was completely towards women. He wasn't attracted to men at all. However, another look caught his eye. Following the source, he saw a beautiful girl with voluminous brown hair and large, lovely eyes, looking at him with a shy, curious gaze. As he blinked at her, Enar heard a soft laugh coming from the young woman and smiled too. Margaery Tyrell, one of his 3 mistresses. The son she would have with him would be a figure of great importance in the future, being one of the 20 Primarchs. Olenna noticed the small movements between Enar and Margaery, although she didn't show it. The Queen of Thorns' eyes analyzed her granddaughter carefully, in a deep gaze that carried years of wisdom and expectation. She knew Margaery better than anyone. Olenna had taught her everything she knew. Every graceful gesture, every carefully calculated smile, every gentle glance, and even the melodious laugh that seemed spontaneous, it was all part of a skillfully molded arsenal for winning hearts. Margaery was ambitious. Perhaps even more so than Olenna had been in her youth. The desire for power burned in her like an intense flame, and the crown wasn't just a goal, it was an absolute dream, the destiny she was determined to reach. Olenna saw this clearly. Every word Margaery exchanged with Enar was wrapped in a layer of charm and intent. Every move, even the most subtle, was a move in the great game. The old matriarch wasn't sure whether to admire or fear her granddaughter for this. Have no regrets, Margaery. Everyone must bear the consequences of their actions, Olenna thought, watching the two of them gradually converse, apparently having a normal, fun conversation. Margaery, for her part, certainly didn't know what her grandmother was thinking, and if she did, she wouldn't have cared. In her eyes, all the focus was on that handsome, powerful dragon rider by her side. Chapter 84, House of Tyrell 3. I want him, even if I never really have him all to myself. Margaery Tyrell, the White Rose. Sitting at the head seat of the high garden table, Enar looked at Olenna and commented with an amused tone. Before I came to the high garden, I flew over King's Landing. They were happy to see Caraxes spitting flames over the city. Olenna stopped her drinking and looked deeply at the king. Her lips curved into a sarcastic smile. Tywin must have loved the show. The Queen of Thorns knew that the young king's words had another purpose, a warning to House Tyrell. Basically, he was saying that everyone knew he was coming to High Garden and that no one would believe that House Tyrell wouldn't bend the knee to survive. It was quite a shrewd move, and considering his age, Olenna knew that the young king was not inexperienced in court affairs. He's probably more desperate to fill his coffers, Enar said, bringing the glass of wine to his lips, not caring if it was poisoned. Olenna looked at Enar with a brief expression of surprise. Tywin worried about gold? She would never have thought that such words could be associated with the rich and powerful Tywin Lannister. Olenna's mind quickly searched for options that could make Tywin worry about gold and found the answer. Are the gold mines running out? Olenna asked with a glare. If that were really the case, then House Tyrell would currently be the strongest house in Westeros. Without money, the Westerlands weren't so dangerous, as they couldn't support an army of 50,000 men. Enar liked to talk to intelligent people. He didn't even need to explain, and Olenna had already found the reason for his words. Lady Olenna is as intelligent as the rumors say. Enar complimented the woman with a glare. Won't you become my master of coin? This time it was the turn of everyone at the table to look at the young king with expressions of surprise. Even Olenna looked at Enar with an amused look. The vain lords will be uncomfortable with a woman in power. Olenna replied in a calm tone as she sipped her wine. Let them feel uncomfortable, I don't care what they think. Enar sipped the wine from her glass and replied with an indifferent tone. I don't care what's between a person's legs. As long as it's useful to me, I can even put a horse on the small council. If they don't like my decisions, they can leave, there are other people who can take their place. Olenna's eyes shone with intensity, and she looked at the young king with an unexpected gaze. I'm glad of the invitation, but I'd rather spend the rest of my days in this relaxed land. I've long since left the intrigues of the court. Olenna responded to Enar's words with a calm, deep tone. Her eyes had analyzed his every action, expression, and word since they began talking. All to understand what Enar's character was. What a shame, I'd love to have Lady Olenna by my side with Tyrion. The two of you would get on very well, Enar said in a disappointed voice. He wasn't lying when he said that. He really wanted Olenna as his left hand, next to Tyrion, who was his right hand. Tyrion Lannister? Tywin's son? Olenna looked at Enar strangely and asked with a hint of incredulity in her voice. Not in her wildest dreams could she have imagined that Tyrion Lannister had bent the knee to the enemy of House Lannister, let alone that Enar could forgive him. Noticing the incredulity on Olenna's face, Enar commented in an amused tone, What can I do? I'm a persuasive man. Tyrion has agreed to be my hand. Your Grace is very open-minded. Many would have killed Tyrion for much less. Olenna gave Enar a deep look. She finally believed that Enar was different from all the men she had met in her long life. Enar smiled and replied, I'm not a monster, Lady Olenna. The only people I want dead are Tywin, Joffrey, my cousin Robert and Gregor Clegane. The others can bend the knee and survive. I'm a benevolent monarch. He wasn't lying, at least not yet. The entire system of government in Westeros would remain the same for some time. When he began his reforms, he would eliminate any rebels who didn't accept the new rules he had made. For now, he would forgive them all. Although I can't hold the position of Master of Coin, my grandson Willis is as competent as I am. Olenna said. If he's as competent as Lady Olenna says, I don't mind having Willis on my small council. But if he's a worthless piece of crap, I'll oust him without any hesitation. I don't need no good-for-nothings on my small council. Enar spoke in a harsh tone, not hiding what she would do to Willis if he wasn't a good fit for the position of Master of Coin. Olenna wasn't offended by Enar's words. On the contrary, she looked at the young monarch with an even more appreciative gaze. I would do the same, Your Grace. Don't hesitate to remove the useless and put the competent on the small council. Many monarchs have gotten this wrong, causing great losses to the kingdom. Enar nodded, and just as he was about to speak, the doors to the dining hall opened abruptly. A young man rushed in, with an anxious expression on his handsome face. Green and gold armor framed his slim, seemingly frail body. I assume this is my new Master of Coin. Enar commented with an amused tone. Willis, this is Enar Targaryen, first of his name. You are the new Master of Coin of the small council. Ignoring her grandson's surprised expression, Olenna spoke directly, without beating about the bush. Willis, who had crossed the hall as quickly as he could, felt his breath catch for a moment when he heard his grandmother's words. Master of Coin him? Recovering from his stupor, Willis understood that this was the position his grandmother had obtained for him. He approached Enar with his crutch and did not hesitate to kneel before the young monarch, who was sitting in the main seat, with Olenna on his left and Mace Tyrell on his right. I am Willis of House Tyrell, Your Grace, he said, facing the young man with silver hair and violet eyes who was watching him intently. Rise, my Master of Coin. Enar replied with a firm, majestic tone. At that moment his aura changed completely. He no longer seemed just gentle and courteous, but a true king. Marjorie and Loras, who were watching the scene from afar, couldn't help but stare at Enar with growing admiration. Marjorie, in particular, would have displayed an expression not at all appropriate for an unmarried lady, had her family not been present. Willis stood up with some difficulty and bowed. Thank you, Your Grace. I won't let you down. To say he wasn't excited would be a lie. He had always wanted to do something besides being Lord of the High Garden and Lord Paramount of Mandor. Now he had the chance to accomplish something great and leave his name in history. Oberyn, my Master of Laws, spoke very highly of you, Lord Willis. Enar commented with a smile as he saw Willis sit down next to Marjorie. Although he had not yet made Oberyn official as Master of Laws, he was prepared to do so in the future. The instant Oberyn's name was mentioned, the big smile of Mace Tyrell, Lord of the High Garden, turned slightly grim. If there was anyone Mace hated deeply, it was Oberyn Martell. Willis had been crippled because of him, but surprisingly the two had become great friends. Willis' smile grew when he heard that his longtime friend had been chosen as Master of Laws on the small council of Enar. Dorne and the Reach. Olenna commented with a keen eye. As House Tyrell had already accepted Enar as their monarch, it was time to prepare for war. Having two kingdoms on their side was already a great advantage. The North, Dorne and the Reach. Enar corrected Olenna gently, causing her to look at him with an expression of complete shock. Then, remembering Enar's origins, Olenna muttered, Honorable, loyal, silent? Even a wolf can lie. Is the North with us, Your Grace? Olenna asked with a deep look. Yes. My uncle Eddard Stark, of House Stark and Lord of the North, has already bent the knee. Enar nodded, confirming Olenna's thoughts. Your Grace was raised in the North, wasn't he? Eddard Stark's bastard. Although it was a question, Olenna was certain of her words. Chapter 85, House of Tyrell 4. The sunless future is terrible, but fear not, I am your Messiah and I will lead you to survive this dark age. Enar I Targaryen, God Emperor of Planetos, speaking to the people as he sat on the Iron Throne. Enar looked at Olenna and shrugged. It wasn't exactly something that could be hidden for eternity. Olenna smiled. Just imagining Robert's face when he found out about the betrayal of the man he considered his brother gave her a certain pleasure. The usurper's expression would certainly be memorable. If the North has bent the knee, so can the Riverlands. Olenna commented, remembering that Eddard Stark's wife was Catelyn Tully, daughter of Hoster Tully, Lord Paramount of the Trident and Lord of Riverrun. However, at the mention of House Tully, she noticed how the young king's countenance darkened. Enar's face took on a dark mixture of restrained fury and murderous intent. The light atmosphere of the hall was immediately replaced by an oppressive weight. Everyone around them paled slightly, not understanding why, but feeling the difficulty of breathing grow by the second. The existence of Tully House is still under consideration. Enar commented with a cold tone, his icy eyes resting on Olenna, devoid of any emotion. The reason for Enar's anger was simple. Hoster Tully had rebelled for no apparent reason, turning traitor just to try and get his blood on the Iron Throne. But the old fish didn't expect Jon Arryn and Eddard Stark to refuse such an ambition, completely thwarting his plans. Of all the great houses, only the Tully were under serious consideration of extinction. For Enar, there was nothing more despicable than ingratitude. House Targaryen had raised the Tully to their peak, but in the end they were the first to betray them, and for no justifiable reason. Although she remained calm, Olenna felt a chill run through her body as she realized the intensity of Enar's aura. Despite her long life and experience, she had the strange feeling that she was facing something other than human. She thought herself foolish for such thoughts, but how could she explain the oppression in the air? Could it be magic? Perhaps. However, Olenna believed it could be something deeper. Your Grace, your wine. Leader approached and poured another goblet for the king. The Lady Commander of the Royal Guard watched Enar's dark face calmly. Although it was the first time she had seen him so consumed with rage, she was not intimidated by the frightening aura emanating from him. Enar's countenance softened after a sip of the wine. He realized that he was allowing his emotions to take control, something that could never happen again. Losing control would be dangerous, perhaps fatal for those around him. Thank you, Lita. Enar thanked her with a gentle smile, while deciding internally that he would perform the life enhancement on Lita that evening. His loyal Lady Commander deserved a boost in all physical aspects. Lita just nodded and stood behind Enar's chair, her hand on the hilt of her sword, ready to draw it at any moment. With Enar's words, the atmosphere became light again. Mace Tyrell in particular silently thanked the gods for this. The Lord of Highgarden's face was sweaty and pale, as if he had just run for miles without stopping. Lord Mace. Enar called out, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. Mace Tyrell, already shaken by recent events, replied with a trembling tone. Yes, your grace. How much food does Reach currently have, and what is the average harvest time? Enar asked, his face serious. The Reach had always been the breadbasket of Westeros, and on a continent where the weather could be unpredictable, with winters lasting years or even decades, the management of food resources was paramount. With the long night approaching, stocking up on food in large quantities was an absolute priority. Running out of supplies in sunless years would be catastrophic. Although Enar considered the possibility of using the energy of the immaterium dimension to act as a temporary sun for the crops, this would lock him into a single location, unable to move should he need to respond to an attack from monsters in another realm. Mace wiped the sweat from his brow before replying. We have enough food to supply the entire kingdom for 5 years. As for crops, wheat and oats take 3 to 4 months to ripen successfully. Other types of food can take a little longer, but 6 months at most. Despite his reputation for being less than competent, Mace was still the Lord of the Reach and knew well the figures that underpinned his house's economy. Very well. Enar nodded. Then his voice became harsh, unquestioning. Stop selling food to Essos immediately. I want you to start stocking up as much as possible. Mace hesitated, but Enar didn't finish. Also, send enough food to sustain 100,000 men for 3 months to the north. Mace stared wide-eyed, stunned. He couldn't imagine the reason for such specific orders. Is there a problem in the north, your grace? The last shipment of food sent to them should be enough. It was enough before 100,000 savages crossed the wall. Enar replied calmly, but his words provoked expressions of surprise and astonishment from everyone around. 100,000 savages? Why would your grace allow these savages to cross the wall and enter the north? Olenna asked with apparent calm, although her mind worked quickly to understand the reasons behind such a decision. Because I don't want our real enemy to gain 100,000 men, women, and giants without any effort. Enar replied, his voice laden with conviction. He knew that the threat of the White Walkers and the Night King could no longer be ignored. The sooner the kingdoms recognized this threat, the quicker he could consolidate his position as savior of Westeros in the face of the impending darkness. Robert? But he can't ally himself with the wildlings. Mace said, even more confused. The idea of Robert the First Baratheon allying himself with the men beyond the wall seemed too absurd. I'm not talking about my cousin. Enar corrected, his sharp gaze settling on Mace. I'm talking about the Night King and his White Walkers. They command an army of undead who don't need to eat or rest. An amused smile appeared on Enar's lips as he observed the reactions around him. Then silence fell over the room. The revelation seemed to suck the air out of the room. Everyone processed the young king's words in their own way, but it was clear that a new weight had been placed on everyone's shoulders. Night King, White Walkers, giants? Olenna repeated with an incredulous tone, as if she expected the young king to be telling a bad joke. However, when she looked into Enar's eyes, her expression changed. There was no humor, just a cold, impenetrable seriousness. I understand it's hard to believe, Enar began, his voice calm and firm, but the long night is coming. And with it, an army of monsters, including undead. Enar knew that words alone would not be enough to convince the others. The stories of the Long Night and the White Walkers were considered ancient legends, something too distant to be taken seriously. But he possessed something more powerful than words he could show. Fixing his gaze first on Mace and then on Olenna, he used a fragment of the future, bringing a vision that spoke for itself. What they saw was simple and at the same time terrifying. A vast snow-covered plain stretched as far as the eye could see. A white mist, thick as milk, enveloped everything around, creating a heavy silence. Then the sound of horses breaking through the snow echoed. Figures emerged from the mist. Olenna and Mace held their breath at the sight of decaying horses, exposed bones and rotting flesh. But the real terror was in the riders. They were tall and thin, with skin as pale as ivory and icy blue eyes that shone like ice stars. Their bones were translucent, almost shiny, and their blood, if it still existed, looked a cold, pale blue. Their number seemed small at first glance, perhaps 5,000 riders. But what followed was a real nightmare, an endless army, undead marching in endless ranks. Suddenly, the army opened up into a perfect corridor. Out of the mist emerged a figure mounted on an immense ice spider. He had a crown made of ice on his head, which seemed to be carved from frozen stone. His eyes glowed with a flaming, inhuman blue that pierced the soul like a blade of ice. A supernatural chill ran through Olenna and Mace's bodies, making them shiver uncontrollably. It was as if death itself was staring at them, icy and implacable. And then, in the blink of an eye, they were back in their chairs in the lounge. They were both breathing heavily, their chests rising and falling in despair. Sweat covered their faces and fear was clear in their eyes. That's what's coming towards us. Enar broke the silence, his voice calm and authoritative. His implacable confidence seemed like a point of light amidst the despair of the sight. Olenna stared at him, still trying to process what she had just experienced. Mace, paler than ever, raised a trembling hand and wiped the sweat from his brow. I'll immediately send the food north and start stocking up as much as possible, Mace declared, his voice still weak but determined. He didn't know how Enar had shown him that vision, and frankly, he didn't care. All he wanted now was for the gods to be merciful and save Westeros from the terrible fate that seemed inevitable.